Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity settles down for the evening, science takes its shoes off by the door, and old stones are allowed to tell their stories at a comfortable pace. Tonight, we are heading to the western slopes of the Caucasus, to forests and mountain foothills near the Black Sea, where thousands of small stone structures sit quietly among trees, moss, fallen leaves, and mountain air. At first glance, they can look almost like tiny houses. They have walls, roofs, fronts, and sometimes a neat round opening in the face, as though someone very small might push aside a stone plug, climb inside and put the kettle on. But these are not cottages, and they were not built for anyone's evening soup. They are dolmens, megalithic stone tombs, made from large, carefully shaped slabs during the Bronze Age, with many of them dating back thousands of years, into the late 4th and 3rd millennia BC. Archaeologists have documented around 3,000 of these monuments in the Western Caucasus, spread across both sides of the Great Caucasus Range and along the northeastern Black Sea coast, often arranged in groups rather than standing alone. And so our question tonight is a simple one, at least on the surface. Who lived in these tiny houses 5,000 years ago? Or perhaps more carefully, who built them? Who used them, who carried the dead to their little stone doors, and who believed that this small chamber, made from slabs heavier than any ordinary person could shift alone, mattered enough to survive for millennia? It is a strange question, because the first answer is that no one really lived in them, not in the ordinary sense. No one woke up in one, stretched their arms, complained about the weather, and wondered where they had left their sandals. These were places for the dead, and possibly for rituals that connected the living to their ancestors. But the shape of them makes the mind hesitate. A tomb that looks like a house asks us to think about death in a different way. It suggests shelter. It suggests a doorway. It suggests that the people of the ancient Caucasus were not simply hiding bodies away, but placing them somewhere deliberate, somewhere built, somewhere that looked as if it belonged between the world of the living and whatever they imagine came next. Before we go any further into those forests, I would love to know where you are listening from tonight. Are you somewhere near mountains or by the sea or in a city where the only ancient stones nearby are probably under several layers of pavement and impatient traffic? And if you were walking through a quiet woodland and came across a small stone building with a round hole in the front, half covered in moss, would you step closer, or would you decide that perhaps the forest could keep that little mystery to itself? There is no wrong answer. Curiosity and caution have both served humans well. One builds archaeology, the other keeps us from poking things that might contain spiders. If you find this kind of slow journey soothing, if old landscapes, ancient people, and gentle science help the day loosen its grip a little, I would be ever so grateful if you gave the video a like and subscribed. It helps this quiet corner of the world reach others who might enjoy falling asleep with a question, rather than a worry. And tonight's question is a good one to carry softly into the dark, because it is both practical and mysterious. These dolmens are real objects, built from stone, with measurable dimensions, construction methods, burial remains, and archaeological dates. But they also belong to a part of human life that is difficult to measure. Memory, ritual, fear, respect, loss, and the need to make a place for those who are no longer speaking. So settle in, slow your thoughts, and let us begin not with a dramatic discovery, but with a quiet walk. Imagine the Western Caucasus in the early morning. The air is damp, the trees are thick, the ground rises and dips as the mountains begin to gather themselves inland from the Black Sea. There are streams moving through valleys, slopes that catch mist, and paths that may have been crossed for generations long before anyone wrote down a name for them. Somewhere in that landscape stands a dolmen. It is not tall like a tower, and it does not try to impress you in the way a pyramid does. It is low, compact, and almost domestic. A stone box with a face, a stone room, a small chamber made with surprising care. The front slab may have a round opening, usually not wide enough for a person to stroll through with dignity, more of an access hole than a doorway. In many Caucasian dolmens, that opening is around 25 to 45 centimetres across, often round, though some examples are square, oval, or semicircular. It could be closed with a stone plug, which already gives the whole thing the oddly familiar feeling of a door with a key, except the key is also a rock and probably not something you want to drop on your toe. What makes these structures especially interesting is not only their age, but their precision. Many were built from large stone slabs fitted together with real technical skill. Some show carefully cut tongues and grooves along the edges so that one slab could lock into another, a little like prehistoric flat-pack furniture, except with far more ceremony and no tiny Allen key hiding in the carpet. The chambers could be trapezoidal, narrowing toward the back, with a roof slab resting above and side slabs forming the walls. Some were later covered or supported by cairns and external stones, so what we see today is sometimes only part of the original arrangement. These were not random piles of rock. They were planned constructions, and they required knowledge of stone, balance, terrain, and labour. They also required agreement. Someone had to decide that this was worth doing. Someone had to organise the work. Someone had to shape the slabs, move them, set them into place, and return to the site again when another burial or ritual was needed. That is where the topic becomes human. A dolmen is not just a thing, it is evidence of cooperation. It tells us that a community had enough shared belief, enough social structure, and enough practical ability to turn heavy stone into a lasting place. When we look at a dolmen now, empty or damaged or half swallowed by roots, we are seeing the remaining outline of decisions made by people whose names are gone. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know the stories they told children at night. We do not know whether they had a favourite hillside, a favourite meal, or that one person in the village who always gave advice even when nobody asked for it. But we do know they lived in a world of mountains, rivers, forests, animals, seasonal change and neighbouring cultures. We know they handled stone with remarkable control. We know they buried their dead collectively in some of these chambers, sometimes using the same monument over a long span of time. Research on Western Caucasus dolmens describes them as collective burial structures, with human remains placed through the front aperture, and in some cases the number of burials in a single dolmen could range from just one or two individuals to many dozens. That detail matters because it changes the way we imagine the little stone house. It was not simply built once, sealed once and forgotten. Many dolmens seem to have been returned to. The round opening was not decorative. It allowed access. The stone plug could be removed, the chamber opened, and remains or offerings placed inside. That means the dolmen had a continuing role in the life of the community. It stood there through seasons. People knew where it was. They may have walked to it along familiar routes, perhaps with grief, perhaps with ritual words, perhaps with food, objects, or gestures we can no longer reconstruct. In one remarkable case, the Koliko dolmen on the Black Sea coast was discovered undisturbed after seasonal flooding revealed it in 2008. Its burial chamber contained disarticulated remains from about 70 individuals, and radiocarbon dating showed use between roughly the 19th and 13th centuries BC, reminding us that some of these monuments continue to matter long after the earliest dolmens had appeared in the region. But tonight, especially at the beginning, we're standing nearer to the older horizon, around 5,000 years ago, when the classic Caucasian dolmen form was already emerging. The Shepsi dolmen, discovered on the Black Sea coast in the Tuaps region, is especially important because radiocarbon dates indicate that the classic trapezoidal dolmen with a porthole slab appeared in the Western Caucasus as early as about 3250 BC. It also shows a construction detail in which the floor slab lay between side slabs embedded in the ground. That may sound like a small technical note, the sort of thing that makes archaeologists lean forward and everyone else quietly reach for another biscuit. But it is important because it helps show how early and how sophisticated this tradition was. It also connects the dolmens to wider Bronze Age developments in the northwestern Caucasus, including contact with the Novosvobodnaya type of the Mykop cultural sphere. Now 3250 BC is a difficult date to feel. We can say it quickly, but it sits far back in human time. It is older than the classical civilizations most people first learn about in school. It belongs to a world before the Roman Empire, before classical Greece, before the Iron Age, before many of the written records that make ancient people feel familiar. And yet, these builders were not vague shadows wandering around in animal skins waiting for history to begin. They were people with skills, traditions, choices, and social worlds of their own. They lived in a region that was not isolated in the simple sense. The Caucasus has always been a meeting place of landscapes, mountains, steppe routes, coastal corridors, river valleys, and zones where ideas, materials, and people could move in complicated ways. The dolmens do not give us a complete biography of those communities, but they give us enough to know that their world was organised, meaningful, and technically capable. There is also something wonderfully misleading about the phrase tiny houses. It makes the dolmens sound almost cosy, and visually some of them really do have that effect. You see a rectangular stone chamber with a little round entrance, and your brain immediately reaches for familiar categories. House, door, room, maybe storage, maybe someone very short. Local legends in parts of the Caucasus have sometimes imagined these monuments as dwellings of small beings or ancient dwarfs, which is understandable. When people encounter old structures whose builders are unknown, stories rush in to fill the space. A tiny house asks for a tiny resident. A sealed stone chamber asks for a secret. The human imagination dislikes an empty doorway. It wants someone to come out. Archaeology, however, asks us to be patient. It tells us to look not only at the shape, but at the contents, the context, the where, the placement, and the broader pattern. When human remains appear inside, when the architecture is repeated across a region, when the access hole makes sense for depositing remains over time, the tiny house becomes something more serious. It becomes a house-shaped tomb, or at least a chamber built with some of the logic of shelter. That is not unusual in human history. Many cultures have imagined the dead as needing a place, a container, a room, a bed, a vessel, a mound, or a house. Sometimes the tomb copies the home, sometimes it does not. But the idea that the dead require architecture is very old. It suggests that people were not simply disposing of bodies, they were arranging relationships. The dead remained part of the social landscape, and that may be one of the first gentle lessons of the Caucasus dolmens. They remind us that the past is not only made from kings, battles, inventions, and dates, it is also made from care. Care can be hard to prove, of course. Archaeologists must be cautious. A stone chamber does not tell us exactly what someone felt when they placed remains inside. We cannot assume grief looked the same then as it does now, or that every burial was tender, or that every ritual was peaceful. Human societies are always more complicated than our neat summaries allow. But the labour itself tells us something. Heavy stones do not arrange themselves into chambers with portholes, because someone had a spare afternoon and no better plans. These structures took effort, and effort usually points toward value. Think about the work for a moment. First, a suitable stone had to be found. Then it had to be cut or shaped. The slabs had to be transported, perhaps not always from very far away, but still with difficulty. The ground had to be prepared. Side slabs had to be set upright. A floor slab might be positioned. A capstone had to be lifted or slid into place. The front slab, with its carefully shaped aperture, had to align with the chamber. If grooves and tongues were used, they had to match. Mistakes would not be easy to fix. This was stone, not a document where you can simply press backspace and pretend you knew what you were doing all along. And once built, the dolmen needed to stand. It needed to resist gravity, rain, soil movement, roots, and time itself. Many have not survived intact, of course. Some were damaged, robbed, reused, studied, neglected, or absorbed into modern landscapes. But enough remained to show that their builders knew what they were doing. At the same time, there is a quiet danger in admiring the architecture too much. We can become so impressed by the stones that we forget the people. The slabs are the evidence, not the whole story. Somewhere behind each dolmen there were daily lives. There were fires, tools, paths, animals, weather, hunger, births, disputes, laughter, illness, and ordinary tasks that left fewer dramatic traces. The people who built these monuments did not spend every hour thinking about death. They also had to live. They had to gather, grow, herd, trade, make, repair, carry, cook, and sleep. The dolmen is what survived best because stone is stubborn, but the living world around it was made of softer things: wood, leather, fibres, food, voices, gestures, and memories. Most of that has vanished. The dolmen remains, like the one durable sentence from a book whose pages have otherwise been lost. That is why the question in the title is useful, even though it is slightly wrong. Who lived in these tiny houses? Strictly speaking, the dead were placed in them, but the living lived around them. The living gave them meaning. The living returned to them. The living saw them in the landscape and knew something about who belonged there. A dolmen may have marked a family, a lineage, a group, a ritual place, or a claim to memory. It may have been as much about the living community as the dead individuals inside. When a monument remains visible, it can say, "Our people are here." It can say, "We remember." It can say, "This place matters." It can also say, "Please do not move this stone unless you have several friends and a very clear plan." The region itself adds another layer to the story. The Western Caucasus is not a flat, simple backdrop. It is a dramatic zone of mountains and foothills, with the Black Sea nearby and ecological variety packed into relatively short distances. The dolmens are distributed across a broad area of roughly 12,000 square kilometres in Russia and Abkhazia, from the Anapa area toward the southeast along the Black Sea side and across slopes of the Great Caucasus. A landscape like that does not produce one single way of life everywhere. Communities could differ by valley, altitude, access to routes, and local resources. Yet the repeated dolmen form suggests shared ideas or connected traditions, not identical lives but a recognisable architectural language. A person moving through that world might have seen different settlements, different groups, perhaps different dialects or customs, and still recognise the meaning of a stone chamber with a little round opening in its face. It is tempting, of course, to turn all of this into one clean answer. The dolmens were tombs. The builders were Bronze Age communities of the Western Caucasus. The purpose was collective burial and ritual. There we are, mystery solved. Everyone may now return to their tea. But archaeology rarely works that neatly. Yes, their mortuary function is well supported. Yes, the porthole chamber is one of their defining features. Yes, the dates place them deep in the Bronze Age. But many questions remain open. Where exactly did the architectural idea begin? How did it develop from earlier local traditions or contacts with neighbouring groups? Why did this form become so widespread in this particular region? Did every dolmen mean the same thing, or did meaning shift over centuries? Were some monuments reserved for certain families or statuses? What ceremonies took place outside the chamber, where the evidence may be harder to preserve? These questions are not failures. They are the reason the stones remain interesting. The little round hole is perhaps the most striking symbol of that uncertainty. It is practical, yes. It allowed access. It could be sealed. It controlled movement between outside and inside. But it also invites interpretation. A round opening in a stone face looks like a boundary made visible. It is not a wide door through which anyone can casually enter. It is small, deliberate, and controlled. It turns the tomb into a place that can be opened only in a particular way. That may have mattered richly. The act of removing the plug, placing something inside, and closing it again could have carried meaning beyond the practical. We must be careful here, because the stones do not explain their own ceremonies. They do not hand us a script and say, Please perform this with a respectful pause after the second line. But human beings often make meaning through repeated actions, and the architecture seems designed for repetition. So tonight we begin with the dolmen as both object and question. It is a small stone building that was not a house, but looks enough like one to pull us closer. It is a tomb, but not a simple grave. It is ancient, but not primitive. It is mysterious, but not beyond study. Its builders belong to a world without written explanations for us to read, but they left behind something more durable than words. They left behind rooms of stone. And as we walk toward one of these structures in the mind, letting the forest grow quiet around it, we can start with what is visible. The front slab, the low roof, the careful joints, the round entrance, dark in the centre, like a question set into rock. We do not need to rush through it. The story has waited several thousand years already, which is a very patient way to wait. First, we will look at the doorway itself, because sometimes the smallest opening is the best place to begin. The doorway is usually the first thing you notice. Not the size of the stones, not the roof slab, not even the fact that the whole structure has been sitting there for thousands of years, while forests grew, fell, burned, returned, and politely pretended not to be impressed. It is the little round opening in the front. It looks too deliberate to be natural, too small to be a normal entrance, and too carefully placed to be just a hole. It sits in the face of the dolmen like a quiet invitation, or perhaps a warning, depending on how much imagination you brought with you on the walk. Many of the Western Caucasus dolmens have this kind of access opening in the front slab, often round and roughly 25 to 45 centimetres across, though square, oval and semicircular versions also exist. The classic trapezoidal dolmen with a porthole slab was already present in the region by around 3250 BC, which means that this little doorway belongs to one of the older architectural traditions of the Bronze Age Caucasus. Imagine finding one not in a museum, where labels and ropes make everything behave, but in the forest. You're walking along a damp path near the foothills, where the Western Caucasus begins folding itself upward from the Black Sea coast. The trees grow close together. Moss softens the stones. Roots slide over the ground like old fingers. Somewhere ahead, partly hidden by leaves and shadow, a shape appears that does not quite belong to the forest, although the forest has clearly been trying to claim it for a very long time. At first, it may look like a large flat rock, then the straight lines appear. One slab upright, another resting across the top, a front face set at an angle, and there, in the middle, the round dark opening. It is a very small thing, but it changes the whole scene. A rock can be ignored. A doorway cannot. A doorway suggests inside and outside. It suggests someone once had a reason to pass something through it. It turns a pile of stone into architecture, and architecture always carries the faint presence of the hands that made it. The strange part is how familiar the shape feels. Human beings are very good at recognizing houses. We notice shelter quickly. A low stone chamber with a front and a roof is enough for the mind to start filling in details that are not really there. A tiny room, a tiny door. A tiny ancient resident, perhaps with tiny ancient opinions about the weather. This is probably one reason these monuments have attracted so many legends. When people find structures this old, made by unknown builders, with openings too small for ordinary use, stories step in. Local traditions in many regions of the world have imagined megaliths as the work of giants, spirits, dwarfs, heroes, or people from some vanished age when the rules of ordinary life were apparently more flexible. In the Caucasus, the small size of the opening has helped feed that feeling. It looks like something built for being slightly outside normal human scale. But archaeology, always the calm friend in the group, asks us to look more closely. The little door was not made for a miniature homeowner. It was an access point into a burial chamber. That may sound simple, but it is worth taking slowly. The opening tells us that the inside mattered. It was not just a symbolic mark on the front. It was not simply decoration. It allowed human remains, offerings or ritual materials to be placed into the chamber, and in many cases it could be closed with a stone plug. Stone plugs have been found associated with Caucasus dolmens, and the repeated use of these portholes suggests a controlled way of opening and closing the tomb. The act itself must have been physically awkward, because the opening is small. You would not walk in. You would kneel, bend, reach, pass, arrange. The body would have to lower itself before the monument. That may have been purely practical, but it is hard not to notice how many human rituals involve exactly that kind of posture. Kneeling, bowing, crouching, entering carefully. The architecture shapes the action. The doorway teaches the body how to behave, and now the forest becomes part of the story. These dolmens were not always hidden in trees in the way many are today. Landscapes change over 5,000 years. Forest cover shifts. Settlements come and go. Paths vanish. Rivers move soil. People cut wood, grow crops, graze animals, leave, return, and forget. What feels remote now may once have been part of a known route or a carefully chosen cemetery area. The Western Caucasus dolmens are spread across a broad region on both sides of the Great Caucasus Range and along the northeastern Black Sea area, with many made from precisely dressed stone slabs or carved into rock, and with the front portal as a consistent feature. So when we picture a lone dolmen in a silent woodland, we should remember that loneliness may be a modern illusion. In its own time, it may have stood in a more open area, or near a route people used often, or within a cluster of monuments where the dead of a community were gathered together. It may have been visible from a settlement, or from a path, or from a ritual space in front of it. The forest may be the newest resident, not the oldest. Still, there is something useful about imagining the dolmen in the woods, because the forest slows us down. It changes the way the structure is encountered. A dolmen in a field can look like an object. A dolmen under trees feels like a discovery. The small doorway seems darker because the leaves have already dimmed the light. The stone face may be streaked with moisture. Insects move across the surface with complete indifference to Bronze Age mortuary architecture. A bird calls somewhere nearby, as if making sure the mood does not become too grand. You step closer, and the first instinct is to peer inside. That is the pull of a small opening. It invites the eye before it invites the body. But what you would see today depends on the dolmen. Some are damaged, some are empty. Some were robbed long ago. Some have collapsed or been restored. Some have been visited so often that their mystery now shares space with muddy footprints and camera phones. The doorway remains, but the chamber behind it has often lost what once made it sacred. This is one of the sad facts about monuments that survive above ground. Their visibility protects their memory but endangers their contents. A hidden grave can remain undisturbed. A visible stone tomb attracts attention. Over centuries, people may open it looking for treasure, building stone, curiosities or answers. Sometimes the damage is ancient, sometimes it is modern. Archaeologists studying megalithic sites often work not with perfect sealed time capsules, but with disturbed remains, missing objects, fragments of pottery, scattered bones, and structural clues. It is rather like trying to understand a library after someone has shaken the shelves, removed half the books, and allowed a goat to make several editorial decisions. Yet even disturbed dolmens can still speak. Their placement, construction, orientation, and repeated forms provide information. The little doorway, especially, keeps telling us that access mattered. One of the most important things about the porthole is that it creates a boundary that can be crossed more than once. A simple grave is often closed and left. A chamber with a plug can be reopened. This points toward collective burial practices, where remains of more than one person could be placed within the same structure over time. Some Western Caucasus dolmens were used as collective sepulchres for long periods, meaning that the monument was not only a burial place but a continuing focus for the living community. This detail changes the emotional weight of the doorway. It was not just the entrance through which one person passed into the past. It may have been opened repeatedly, perhaps for generations. The living may have returned carrying the dead, or carrying parts of the dead after earlier treatment of the body, or bringing offerings whose exact meanings are now beyond reach. Each opening may have renewed the relationship between the people outside and the ancestors inside. There is a practical side to this as well. The small aperture helps protect the chamber while still allowing access. A large door would weaken the front slab and make the structure easier for animals, weather, or people to disturb. A small opening can be plugged securely. It also limits what can pass through, which may tell us something about burial procedure. If a body was placed inside whole, the structure may have needed to be opened during construction, or accessed differently before the roof was sealed. But if remains were placed later through the porthole, then they were likely disarticulated or arranged in a way that allowed passage through a small space. Archaeologists have found collective and often mixed human remains in dolmens, which suggests that burial practice could involve stages, rearrangement, or repeated depositions rather than a single simple interment. The small door therefore becomes more than a charming feature. It is a technical clue to ritual behaviour. That phrase, ritual behaviour, can sound dry, like something written on a museum panel just before lunch. But behind it were real people doing difficult things at emotionally charged times. Someone had died. The body had to be dealt with. The community had to respond. The dead person had to be placed into a social and spiritual order, whatever that order was. The dolmen gave that process a location. It made grief walk to a particular place. It gave mourning a stone front and a small dark opening. It turned memory into architecture. And because the dolmen lasted, it may have allowed later generations to remain connected to people they had never met. A child could be taken to the same stone chamber, where grandparents, ancestors, or important members of the group had been placed. The little door could become familiar long before its full meaning was understood, much as children today may know the quiet seriousness of a cemetery before they understand the full weight of death. The front of the dolmen often includes more than the opening itself. Some have decorated slabs, carved motifs, or architectural features that frame the portal. The decoration is not usually elaborate compared with later monumental art, but it can include zigzags, concentric circles, hanging triangles, and designs that seem to emphasize the porthole area. That focus is important. The front face was the side that people approached. It was the public side of a private chamber. If ceremonies took place outside, then the facade was the stage. In some dolmen complexes, there were courtyard-like spaces in front, outlined by stones, where activity may have occurred. So the little door was not floating alone in meaning. It was part of an arrangement. Approach, front space, stone face, opening, plug, chamber, remains. The more we look, the less the dolmen resembles a random tiny house, and the more it resembles a carefully controlled meeting point between worlds of action and memory. Of course, we have to be careful with phrases like between worlds. They sound satisfying, and they may even be right in a broad sense, but the exact beliefs of the dolmen builders are not written down. We do not know whether they imagined an underworld, a sky world, ancestral spirits, household dead, rebirth, sleep, transformation, or something else entirely. We do not know whether the openings symbolized a mouth, a womb, a passage, a sun, an eye, or simply an efficient hole in a large stone slab. Archaeology can identify patterns, but belief is often softer than stone. Still, architecture made for the dead usually carries some idea about what the dead are, where they belong, and how the living should treat them. The porthole is therefore a very reasonable place to begin thinking about meaning, even if we must keep our feet on the ground and avoid floating away into anything too confident. There is also the matter of scale. These dolmens are small compared with the great stone monuments that usually dominate popular imagination. They are not Stonehenge. They are not Egyptian pyramids. They do not rise over the landscape with royal certainty. Many are low enough that you might almost miss them if you were distracted by your phone, a mushroom, or the sudden realization that you have walked farther from the path than intended. But small does not mean simple. In fact, Their compactness may be part of their power. A large monument can overwhelm you from a distance. A small one asks you to come close. It brings the encounter down to the scale of the body. You stand before it. You bend toward the opening. You notice the thickness of the front slab. You see how the roof rests on the walls. You understand that a human hand, or many human hands, shaped this stone into a place. The monument does not shout. It waits. And waiting is something these dolmens have done extremely well. 5,000 years is not a number the mind easily handles. It is too large for ordinary imagination and too small for geology, which is rather unfair of it. A stone can sit through 5,000 years as if mildly inconvenienced. For humans, that span contains almost everything we mean by ancient history. Languages rise and disappear. Peoples move. Empires form, grow proud, collapse, and become exam questions. Forests change. Religions shift. Coastlines and settlements alter. And through all of that, some of these small stone rooms remain with their little doorways still visible. Not untouched, not unchanged, but present. When someone today stands in front of one, they are doing something people may have done thousands of years ago, facing the opening. The context is different. The modern visitor may have hiking shoes, a camera, a water bottle, perhaps a snack that has become slightly squashed in a backpack. The ancient visitor may have come with a group, with remains, with offerings, with words, with silence. But the basic orientation is the same. Person outside, stone chamber ahead, dark opening in front. It is a rare and humbling continuity. The object shapes the human posture across time. There is another reason the doorway matters so much. It prevents the dolmen from being fully closed in our imagination. A sealed box is final. A box with a hole remains in conversation with the outside. Even when plugged, the existence of the aperture says that closure was designed to be reversible. That is a very different idea of a tomb. It suggests that death did not remove a person entirely from the community. The dead were placed inside, but the living could still return to the threshold. The chamber could be reopened. The ancestors could be approached, perhaps invoked, honoured, joined, or cared for. Again, we cannot know the exact words or beliefs, but the architecture keeps pointing toward relationship rather than abandonment. The forest setting can make this relationship feel almost intimate. A dolmen surrounded by trees is not just an archaeological feature. It becomes part of a living environment. Rainwater runs over the capstone. Leaves gather at the base. Ferns and moss grow in cracks. Animals pass without concern for chronology. Seasons change the monument's mood, though stones do not have moods, strictly speaking, unless you are very tired and have spent too long reading about megaliths. In spring, the opening may be softened by green growth. In autumn, it may sit among brown leaves like something from an old tale. In winter, if snow falls, the dark circle can look sharper against the pale ground. These modern scenes are not the same as the Bronze Age setting, but they help us feel how a monument can become anchored in landscape. It is not just built once, it is encountered again and again under changing light. For the people who made it, choosing the location must have mattered. Dolmens were not placed randomly. They often occur in groups, and their distribution suggests relationships to terrain, routes, and perhaps settlement zones. Some stand near rivers or slopes, others are part of cemetery-like clusters. The site in front of a dolmen may have allowed people to gather. The doorway may have faced a direction that mattered locally, though orientation patterns are not always simple. What we can say is that building a megalithic chamber requires more than finding any available patch of ground. The place must be prepared. The stones must be moved there or quarried nearby. The builders must decide where the front will be, where the approach will be, where the chamber will rest. Every dolmen is a set of choices turned into stone. The little doorway also reminds us how much ancient architecture depends on touch. We often look at these monuments through photographs, and photographs flatten them into images, but to build one, and perhaps to use one, was physical. Stone is cold in the morning and warm in the sun. Its edges can cut, scrape, bruise or wear smooth under repeated contact. The plug that closed the porthole had weight. Removing it required effort. Passing remains through the opening required care. The person doing it may have felt the stone against their arm or shoulder. They may have smelled damp earth, smoke from a nearby fire, or the particular mineral smell of wet rock. The past was not a set of diagrams. It was full of textures, smells, awkward movements, tired backs, and probably someone giving instructions that were either helpful or deeply annoying. From a distance, the dolmen may seem mysterious because it is old. Up close, it becomes mysterious because it is practical. That combination is what makes it so compelling. The porthole is not just symbolic, not just functional, but both at once. It is a solution to a problem we only partly understand. How do you keep a burial chamber closed while allowing repeated access? How do you make the dead present but contained? How do you create a place that lasts longer than the people who know the names of those inside? The small door answers in stone, like this. And perhaps that is why, even now, the first encounter with a dolmen is usually quiet. Even people who know nothing about the Bronze Age often lower their voices near old tombs. There is an instinctive respect around places made for the dead. Not always, of course. Humans are also very capable of climbing on things they should not climb on, carving initials into things that were doing perfectly well without initials, and treating archaeological sites as background decoration for heroic social media poses. But many visitors do feel something when they see that opening. Not supernatural necessarily. Not fear. More like recognition. Someone made this. Someone used this. Someone was placed inside. A human story passed through that little hole, and the stone has outlasted almost every detail of it. The dolmen in the forest therefore gives us a beginning that is not based on spectacle, but attention. We're not starting with a king's tomb full of gold. We're starting with a small doorway and a stone face. That doorway asks us to think about how people in the ancient Caucasus treated death, memory, and community. It asks us to notice the skill required to build something so compact and durable. It asks us to resist easy answers. It may look like a tiny house, but it is really a carefully made chamber for people who belong to a world we can only approach through fragments. So we stay outside for a while. We look at the round opening. We imagine the plug that once sealed it. We notice how the front slab stands as both wall and threshold. We let the forest settle around the monument without turning it into fantasy. Then, slowly, the question widens. If there was a little door, there had to be a chamber behind it. If there was a chamber, there had to be builders who knew how to cut, fit, and balance stone. And if they could make stone behave this precisely, then these people were not merely stacking rocks in the hope that gravity would be in a generous mood. They were practicing an architecture of memory, one slab at a time, and the next thing to understand is how those slabs were shaped so carefully that, after thousands of years, the walls still seem to remember the hands that placed them. To understand these little stone houses properly, it helps to stop thinking of them as ruins for a moment and start thinking of them as problems solved in stone. Not mysteries in the dramatic sense, not glowing symbols left by a vanished civilization that knew the secrets of the universe and possibly better plumbing, but practical problems. How do you make a chamber that will last? How do you shape slabs so they stand together? How do you close a space but not close it forever? How do you build something heavy enough to survive storms, roots, soil, animals, and the general inconvenience of several thousand years? The people of the Western Caucasus answered with a kind of architecture that was compact, precise, and surprisingly clever. The typical slab-built dolmen was made from a small number of large stones. A floor or foundation slab, 2 side slabs, a rear slab, a front portal slab, and a roof slab, fitted together to create a chamber that could be entered or accessed through the small opening in the front. That sounds almost simple when said quickly. 6 slabs, put them together, add a hole. There we are, Bronze Age architecture before bedtime. But of course, Nothing about it was simple. A single roof slab could be enormously heavy. The side slabs had to stand at the right angle. The floor needed to support the chamber. The front slab had to fit between the walls, hold the porthole, and remain stable. If the stones did not meet properly, the structure could shift, leak, crack, or collapse. If the builders misjudged the weight of the capstone, the whole project could become less of a tomb and more of an unfortunate lesson in gravity. And gravity, as we know, is very patient. It will wait politely for you to make a mistake, then remind you at once. So the first thing these dolmens tell us is that their builders understood stone, not in the modern engineering sense with formulas, cranes, steel scaffolding, and someone in a bright vest looking deeply concerned, but in a practical, experienced, hands-on way. They knew which stone could be split into slabs. They knew how thick a slab needed to be. They knew how edges should meet. They knew that a chamber roof required support not just at the moment of construction, but through years of rain and temperature change. Some Caucasian dolmens were made from carefully dressed blocks, and some examples used tongue and groove joints, where one stone edge was shaped to fit into another, improving stability and alignment. This is one of those details that may not sound dramatic until you picture someone doing it with Bronze Age tools, long before diamond saws, mechanical drills, and the luxury of saying, perhaps we should just order the parts online. The stone had to be chosen first. That may be the least glamorous step, but it is one of the most important. Not every boulder wants to become a dolmen, no matter how strongly an archaeologist might encourage it. The builders needed rock that could be worked into slabs, large enough to form walls and roofs, strong enough to hold together, but not so impossible to shape that the whole community would give up and decide that perhaps a wooden memorial was perfectly respectable. In the Western Caucasus, suitable sandstone and other workable stone sources were available in many areas, and some dolmens seem to have been made from locally available material. Even so, local does not mean easy. A slab lying a short distance away is still a large slab, and large slabs do not stroll politely to the building site. They have to be moved. We do not know exactly how every dolmen slab was transported. Archaeologists can infer possibilities from ethnography, experimental archaeology, terrain, and basic physics. But the builders left us no instruction manual. There were no helpful diagrams labelled Step 4, persuade 30 tired people to pull the roof slab uphill. They may have used wooden rollers, sledges, ropes made from plant fibre or hide, levers, packed earth ramps, and coordinated labour. Wet clay or mud could reduce friction. Logs could help with movement. Gentle slopes could be used strategically, though the landscape of the Caucasus is not always in the mood to be gentle. What matters is not that we know every method in detail, but that the movement of slabs required planning. These were not casual objects, they demanded a group. That group may not have been enormous, but it had to be organised. 1 or 2 people could shape small stones, but raising a dolmen meant coordinating labour over time. Some individuals may have known stoneworking better than others. Some may have directed the placement. Some may have prepared the ground. Some may have carried water, food, rope, wood, or tools. Others may have watched children, tended animals, or continued ordinary tasks while the monument was being made. A dolmen looks like a compact object, but it points outward into a whole social world. It tells us that people could gather labour around a shared purpose. They had to agree, or at least be persuaded, that this particular place, this particular chamber, and these particular dead were worth the effort. The shaping of the slabs adds another layer to the story. Many dolmens are not just rough stones propped together. Their surfaces and edges were worked. Some have corners cut with care. Some have side slabs that lean inward slightly, giving the chamber a trapezoidal plan, narrower at the back than at the front. The Shepsy dolmen, one of the oldest known examples of the classic Western Caucasus porthole type, shows that this trapezoidal construction was already present around 3250 BC, and it had a floor slab placed between side slabs that were embedded in the ground. That detail is quietly impressive. It means the builders were not simply putting stones on top of the earth. They were setting the walls down into it, locking the chamber into the ground, using the earth itself as part of the support system. If you have ever tried to assemble a shelf and discovered too late that the floor is uneven, you may appreciate the elegance of embedding the side slabs before adding a roof stone that weighs rather more than a bookshelf and has fewer forgiving screws. The porthole slab was perhaps the most technically demanding piece. It had to form the front of the tomb, hold its place within the structure, and contain an opening shaped deliberately through the stone. Round openings are common, but not universal. Some are square, oval, or semicircular. Making a circular hole in a slab is not trivial. It requires planning, repeated striking, grinding, pecking or abrasion, and a sense of proportion. The hole had to be large enough for the intended use, but not so large that the slab weakened dangerously. It had to be placed where the chamber could be accessed. It had to align with the interior space, and it often had to accept a plug, a shaped stone stopper that could close the tomb. The result is one of the most recognisable features of the Caucasian dolmens, a stone face with a dark, controlled opening at the centre. There is something almost domestic about that plug. It is not a door in the ordinary sense, but it behaves like one. It can close, it can open. It marks the difference between the protected inside and the world outside. Some plugs were rounded, some shaped, and some may have been made to fit specific apertures. You can imagine the care involved in that fit. Too loose, and it would not seal properly. Too tight, and reopening it would become a community workout nobody requested. A good plug is a small triumph of practical design. It says that the builders expected the opening to matter more than once. It also reminds us that the dolmen was not only an object to look at, it was a working ritual structure designed for use over time. The roof slab may have been the most dramatic moment of construction. Once the side walls, rear wall, front slab and floor were prepared, the capstone had to be lifted, slid or levered into place. This is the point in any megalithic building project when everyone involved must become extremely serious, because a roof slab does not forgive unclear communication. There may have been ramps of earth or timber supports. The slab could have been dragged upward gradually and then lowered into place. The builders may have used levers to adjust it. The whole event would have required timing and trust. One person slipping, one support breaking, one misjudged angle, and the project could become dangerous very quickly. Yet thousands of these monuments were built across the region, which means the knowledge was not an isolated accident. It was a tradition. The word tradition is important here. A single dolmen could be the experiment of one remarkable group. Thousands of dolmens across the Western Caucasus suggest shared habits of building and belief. The region contains a wide variety of dolmen forms, including rectangular, trapezoidal, square and round plans, with structures made from slabs or carved partly into rock. But the recurring portal in the facade remains one of the defining features. This variety tells us that the builders were not copying a pattern mechanically in every case. They adapted it. They used different layouts, different stones, different details. But the general idea remained recognisable. A stone chamber, a front face, an opening, a place for the dead, and likely an area outside where the living could approach. In some cases, the builders went beyond simple slab construction. Some dolmens were carved directly into rock, creating a chamber out of a natural mass rather than assembling separate stones. Others were composite, built from multiple fitted blocks. Some had decorated facades. Some were associated with stone courtyards in front. Some stood alone, and others formed groups. The architecture could be plain or more elaborate, but even the plain examples required a disciplined understanding of material. It is worth remembering that plain does not mean careless. A smooth, undecorated slab can be just as intentional as a carved one. Sometimes the real artistry is in the fit. That fit is where the phrase "stones cut like memory" begins to make sense in a practical way. Memory is not only what people remember in their minds. Communities can put memory into places. They can build it into paths, graves, landmarks, and stones. The dolmen builders shaped slabs so that they would hold together long after the hands that made them were gone. The fitted edges became a kind of physical remembering. One stone leaned into another, one groove accepted one tongue, one roof rested on one set of walls. The structure preserved a relationship, not just between stones, but between people, place, and the dead. The builders did not write a history, but they made something that forced later generations to notice that a history had happened there. Of course, we should not imagine the work as clean and ceremonial from start to finish. There must have been mud. There must have been mistakes. There must have been tired workers, broken tools, awkward angles, and someone insisting that the stone should be moved a little to the left when everyone else was fairly certain that a little to the left was no longer an available option. Building in stone is slow, stubborn labour. Even small corrections can require many hands. The finished dolmen may look calm, but its construction was probably noisy. Striking, scraping, dragging, calling, breathing, arguing, perhaps singing or chanting if work rhythms helped coordinate movement. A monument that now invites silence may have been born in sound. The tools themselves would have shaped what was possible. Bronze Age does not mean bronze was used for every task, and stoneworking often relied on harder stones, hammerstones, picks, abrasives, and patient repeated action. Metal tools, where available, were valuable and not always ideal for heavy stone cutting. Wood, bone, antler, fibre, hide, and stone all had roles in ancient construction. The exact toolkit would vary by period and local context, but the important point is that the builders were not using crude methods because they lacked intelligence. They were using available materials with skill. Modern people often make the mistake of confusing technological simplicity with mental simplicity, as though people without electricity were somehow wandering about in a permanent state of confusion. In reality, ancient builders could be extraordinarily observant. They knew weight, fracture, friction, slope, balance, and teamwork because their lives required that knowledge. Think about the stone surface. To make slabs meet well, the builders had to understand flatness. Not perfect machine flatness, but functional flatness. A wall slab needed enough contact with the floor and roof to distribute weight. A rear slab needed to close the chamber. If the structure used grooves, those grooves had to be placed with care. A poorly cut groove is not a groove. It is a future problem pretending to be craftsmanship. The builders also had to consider drainage and stability. Water is one of the great slow enemies of monuments. It enters cracks, freezes, expands, carries soil, encourages roots, and generally behaves like a very patient saboteur. A dolmen that lasted required more than impressive stones. It required a shape and setting that could endure. When we look at a dolmen today, we're often seeing the skeleton of a larger original arrangement. Some dolmens may once have been covered by mounds or surrounded by cairns. Some had forecourts or enclosing stones. Some were part of cemetery landscapes that included multiple monuments and activity areas. The exposed little stone house may be what remains after earth. Smaller stones and outer features have eroded or been removed. This matters because the dolmen may not have looked in the Bronze Age exactly as it looks now. The crisp chamber in the forest may once have been partly hidden, framed, or incorporated into a larger structure. Its small doorway may have been approached through a defined space, not simply encountered from any direction by a wandering hiker with a sandwich. This also means the construction process may have involved stages. First, the place was chosen and prepared. Then stones were quarried or selected. Slabs were shaped roughly, moved, refined, and set. The chamber was assembled. The porthole was blocked or left accessible. A mound or cairn may have been added. A front court may have been arranged. Later visits could bring new remains, offerings, repairs, or changes. The dolmen was not only a built thing, it was a maintained thing. Even if maintenance was occasional, the monument likely remained within the memory of the community. People knew it. They could point to it. They could say, perhaps in words completely lost to us, that this was where certain dead belonged. The process of cutting and fitting stone may also have had social meaning beyond practical construction. In many societies, building a tomb is an act of respect, but also a display. It tells others that a group has labour, knowledge, and continuity. A well-made dolmen could have signalled identity. It may have marked a lineage or community with enough cohesion to build in durable material. It may have been a statement to neighbours, travellers and descendants. Not a boast in the modern sense, perhaps, but a visible claim. We are here, our dead are here. This place has history. Stone is very good at making such claims because it does not rot quickly, forget easily, or politely move aside when later people arrive. There is a useful comparison here with houses for the living. A house is not just shelter, it also expresses social life. It shows what materials are available, how people organise space, what they value, how they define inside and outside, public and private, ordinary and sacred. A dolmen does something similar for the dead. Its small chamber is not a living room, but it is still a room. Its front opening is not a door for everyday movement, but it is still a threshold. Its construction is not domestic, but it borrows the language of built enclosure. That may be why it feels so strangely familiar. The dead were not scattered randomly into the landscape. They were placed in architecture. They were given walls. The fact that so many dolmens were built in the Western Caucasus also suggests that stoneworking knowledge moved between groups. This does not necessarily mean there was one centralised authority directing construction, nor does it require us to imagine a single dolmen people marching around with standardised blueprints. Traditions can spread through contact, marriage, imitation, shared ritual, skilled specialists, or gradual local development. A builder from one valley might know techniques used in another. A community might copy a nearby monument, but adapt it to local stone. A ritual idea might travel along routes between mountains and coast. The Caucasus was never simply a remote corner of the map. It was a complex region of connections, and the dolmens were part of that world. The workmanship can make us wonder whether some individuals were specialists. Did certain people know how to cut the portholes? Did some families or groups hold construction knowledge? Were there recognised builders whose skills were requested by neighbouring communities? We cannot answer with certainty, but the quality and repetition of the architecture make the question reasonable. A good dolmen required experience. Someone had to understand the sequence. Someone had to know when a slab was thick enough, how to seat it, how to shape the joint, how to prevent collapse. Skills like that do not appear fully formed in a single afternoon, unless one is having a particularly productive afternoon, which seems unlikely when dealing with multi-ton stones. Yet we should not imagine these builders as engineers detached from ritual life. In ancient communities, practical and sacred knowledge often overlapped. The person who knew how to place the stone may also have understood where it should face, when construction should begin, what offerings were appropriate, or how the dead should be handled. The work itself may have been ritualised. Cutting, moving, and setting stones could have been accompanied by feasting, songs, restrictions, ceremonies, or social obligations. Again, evidence for exact practices is limited, but it would be strange to assume that building a tomb was merely a construction job. For the people involved, the labour probably carried meaning from the first chosen slab to the final closing of the aperture. There is a gentle irony in the durability of the stones. The builders may have wanted the dolmens to last, but they probably did not imagine modern archaeologists measuring them, classifying their joints, debating their origins, and placing them into papers with careful footnotes. They may not have imagined people thousands of years later calling them tiny houses in a video designed to help strangers fall asleep. The future is rarely what the past expects, yet the builders did succeed in one important way. They made us stop. They made us look closely at their work. They made their dead, or at least the places of their dead, difficult to ignore. If we look long enough, the dolmen stops being only a tomb and becomes a record of decisions. The side slabs say someone chose stability. The porthole says someone wanted controlled access. The roof slab says someone mastered lifting and support. The fitted joints say someone valued precision. The placement says someone cared about landscape. The repetition across the region says many communities shared a tradition strong enough to outlast individual lives. None of these stones tells the whole story alone, but together they form a quiet grammar. Wall, roof, floor, front, opening, plug. Closed, opened, closed again. Dead inside, living outside, memory between them, and perhaps that is the most important thing to carry forward. These dolmens were not miraculous structures made by unknown magic, nor were they simple heaps left by people with nothing better to do. They were built by skilled Bronze Age communities who understood stone and used it to create lasting places for the dead. Their precision was not cold or mechanical. It served a human purpose. Each cut edge, each fitted slab, each carefully shaped doorway helped preserve a relationship that mattered. As the evening deepens around this imagined forest, the stones begin to feel less like mute objects and more like the remains of a conversation. One side of the conversation is still visible: the slabs, the porthole, the chamber, the workmanship. The other side is harder to hear: the voices of the people who gathered there, the names of the dead, the beliefs that made the labour necessary. To reach those people, we have to step beyond the architecture and ask what kind of communities could produce it, what they ate, how they moved, what they valued, and why a small stone chamber with a round, dark opening became one of the most enduring marks they left on Earth. The people behind the portholes are harder to see than the stones they left behind. That is almost always the way with prehistory. Stone survives with a stubborn little shrug, while names, jokes, songs, arguments, recipes, and family stories vanish unless someone writes them down. And the builders of the Western Caucasus dolmens did not leave us written records. So, we have to begin with a careful answer. We do not know their personal names, their language, or exactly what they called themselves. We should not casually dress them in the identity of any modern people and pretend the matter is settled, because 5,000 years is a long time for languages, populations, and cultures to change. What archaeology gives us instead is a pattern. Bronze Age communities living in and around the Western Caucasus, near mountain slopes, valleys, and the Black Sea region, who built thousands of stone tombs over many centuries. The dolmen tradition in the Western Caucasus is generally placed within the Bronze Age, with the classic porthole dolmen form appearing by about 3250 BC and continuing in different forms through later periods. That may sound less satisfying than a neat name, but it is more honest. When we ask who they were, we are really asking several questions at once. What kind of people had the skill to build these tombs? What kind of society had the organisation to bring workers together? What did they eat? How did they travel? Who did they trade with? Why did they bury their dead this way? And what did a small stone chamber with a round opening mean to them? None of those questions has one simple answer, because the dolmens were built across a broad landscape and over a long span of time. The people who made the earliest ones were not necessarily identical in every way to the people who used later ones. A tradition can last while the people within it change, just as a village church, family cemetery, or old market road can remain important through generations of people who no longer speak exactly like their great-grandparents, dress like them, or cook quite the same soup. The safest broad description is that these were local Bronze Age communities of the northwestern and western Caucasus, connected in some way to the wider world of the Maikop and Novosvobodnaya cultural sphere, but also distinct in their own monumental tradition. The Shepsy dolmen, one of the oldest known classic porthole dolmens in the region, has been linked by its material context and radiocarbon dates to a period when this dolmen building tradition coexisted with the Novosvobodnaya type of the Maikop culture on the northern side of the main Caucasus ridge. That matters because the Maikop world was not a small or isolated one. It belonged to a broader early Bronze Age network of the Caucasus and neighbouring regions, where metalworking, prestige goods, burial customs and long-distance contacts were already important. The dolmen builders were not living outside history in some forgotten forest corner. They were part of a changing Bronze Age world, though their own way of making memory in stone was unusually distinctive. Still, even the term culture can mislead us if we imagine it too rigidly. In archaeology, a culture often means a group of repeated material patterns, pottery styles, burial forms, tools, ornaments, settlement traces, and building traditions. It does not automatically mean one tribe, one language, one political unit, or one people marching around under a shared banner with matching hats. The people who built dolmens may have included different communities who shared certain customs, borrowed ideas from one another, and adapted them to local circumstances. One valley might build in a slightly different way from another. One group might use a dolmen for many generations, while another might build a new one for a different set of ancestors. The shared porthole form tells us that ideas moved, but it does not tell us that everyone involved thought of themselves as one single nation. Prehistory is rarely that tidy, and when it is, we should probably check whether someone has swept the inconvenient bits under a very large rug. So let us picture them from the ground up, not as a label, but as living communities. The Western Caucasus is a varied region. There are mountains, foothills, river valleys, forests and coastal zones. A day's movement could carry a person through different resources and different weather. In such a landscape, people likely depended on a mixed economy, combining herding, farming, gathering, hunting and exchange in ways that varied by place. Domestic animals would have mattered not only as food but as wealth, mobility and social value. Cattle, sheep, goats, and possibly pigs would have shaped daily routines. Animals need pastures, water, protection, and seasonal movement. They are not stored like pots on a shelf, though anyone who has owned goats may suspect goats would prefer to be stored nowhere and supervise everything personally. Herding creates paths. It makes people aware of slopes, springs, summer grazing, winter shelter, and neighbours who may or may not agree about where one group's animals should be standing. Farming, too, would have tied people to seasons. Bronze Age communities in the Caucasus and surrounding regions cultivated cereals and used grinding stones, storage vessels, and tools for food preparation. Even where herding was important, grain could provide a steady base. Growing crops requires planning. You clear ground, plant, wait, protect, harvest, dry, store, grind, cook, and hope that weather, pests and other people behave themselves, which is a rather optimistic agricultural strategy, but one humanity has pursued for a long time. Food production would have shaped the rhythm of life. There would be busy seasons and quieter ones, times when building a dolmen was possible, and times when everyone's labour was needed elsewhere. A large stone monument could not be built just because someone had a dramatic feeling on a Tuesday. It had to fit into the practical calendar of the community. The people behind the portholes would have lived in houses that have not survived as well as the tombs. That is one of the basic unfairnesses of archaeology. The dead often get better architecture than the living, at least in terms of durability. Houses for the living were probably made with wood, wattle, clay, thatch, and other materials far more vulnerable to time than the slabs of a dolmen. A settlement might disappear into soil, leaving post holes, hearths, pottery fragments, animal bones, and traces that require trained eyes to recognise. A dolmen remains visible and therefore becomes famous. It is rather like history giving all the attention to the person who wore the stone coat. But the missing houses matter because they remind us that the builders did not spend their lives inside the tomb landscape. They had homes, work areas, fires, storage spaces, animal pens, and places where children learned how to behave, or at least were encouraged to behave with limited success. Daily life would have involved repeated work. There would be wood to cut, food to prepare, animals to tend, tools to repair, water to carry, clay to shape, hides to process, fibres to twist, and fires to maintain. Metal existed, but it was valuable. The Bronze Age was not an age where everyone casually opened a drawer full of bronze equipment as if preparing for a modern camping trip. Metalworking required ore, knowledge, fuel, furnaces, and exchange networks. The Caucasus was rich in metallurgical traditions, and the Mycop cultural world is especially known for impressive metal goods, but that does not mean every person had easy access to metal tools. Many tasks still depended on stone, bone, wood, and patient hands. The people who built the dolmens probably lived in a world where materials had to be understood intimately. You did not throw something away because a newer version had appeared in a shop. You repaired, reused, reshaped, and adapted. This practical intelligence is important because older archaeological cultures are sometimes imagined in extremes. Either they are treated as mysterious sages who knew impossible secrets, or as simple people who barely understood what they were doing. The truth is more interesting and more human. They were capable people working within the technologies and beliefs of their time. They did not need magic to build dolmens. They needed stone knowledge, coordination, tools, time, and purpose. They did not need to be primitive to believe in powerful rituals around death. Modern people also build elaborate places for the dead, speak to graves, keep ashes, preserve photographs, visit cemeteries, and maintain anniversaries. Human beings do not stop being practical when they become emotional. In fact, some of our most practical work is done because we care. There were probably differences in status within these communities. Monumental tomb building often suggests social organisation beyond a completely loose set of households. Someone could mobilise labour. Certain dead may have been selected for placement in dolmens, while others may have been treated differently. Collective burial does not necessarily mean all people were equal. A tomb can gather a group and still reflect distinctions within that group. Some individuals may have been elders, ritual specialists, lineage heads, skilled craftspeople, warriors, or people whose roles we cannot name. But we should not rush into imagining kings behind every stone door. A dolmen does not automatically require a state, a ruler, or a palace economy. Many societies without centralized states have built impressive monuments through kinship obligations, ritual authority, seasonal gatherings, and shared belief. A community can organize hard labor without first inventing a throne, although someone probably did still stand nearby explaining that the roof slab needed to move just a bit more. The dolmens may have belonged to kin groups, clans, or local communities whose identity was tied to ancestors. If a dolmen held multiple individuals over time, then it could have functioned as a place where the dead of a group accumulated, turning the chamber into a physical record of belonging. Human remains in Western Caucasus dolmens often indicate collective burial use, and some monuments contained many individuals rather than a single body. This kind of burial practice can create a powerful connection between people and place. The dead are not scattered across the landscape in unrelated graves. They're gathered in a chamber that people can return to. The front opening allows that relationship to continue. It is a doorway not for daily living, but for repeated contact with the ancestors, or at least with the remains of those the group chose to preserve together. What would it have felt like to belong to such a community? We have to imagine cautiously. A person might know the dolmen from childhood. It might stand near a route used during herding, gathering, or travel. Adults might speak of it with respect. Children might be told not to play around it, which of course would make it intensely interesting. During ceremonies, people might gather in front of it. The plug might be removed. Remains might be placed inside. Objects might be added. The chamber might already contain bones of earlier dead, rearranged over time. The newly dead would join those already there. The community outside would continue living, but the stone chamber would grow heavier with memory, even if the stones themselves did not change. We also have to remember that death in the Bronze Age was not hidden away in the way many modern societies try to hide it. People lived closer to animals, sickness, injury, childbirth risk, seasonal hunger, and physical danger. Death would have been more visible. That does not mean it was less painful. Familiarity is not indifference. A community that built durable tombs may have been responding to death with structure, repetition, and shared action. The dolmen gave people something to do at a moment when life had become disorderly. It made grief procedural. There was a place to go, a stone to open, an act to perform, and a chamber where the dead would be placed among others. That kind of structure can be deeply comforting, even when the belief behind it is unknown to us. The people behind the portholes also lived in a world of contact. The Caucasus is famous for being both a barrier and a corridor. Mountains can separate communities, but passes, valleys, and coastlines can connect them. The Black Sea coast offered routes of movement, while the northern slopes and steppe zones opened toward other cultural worlds. Materials, technologies, and ideas could travel. The resemblance between some dolmen material and the Maikop or Novosvobodnaya sphere suggests that the dolmen builders were not sealed off from neighbouring developments. But contact does not mean simple copying. People borrow ideas and make them their own. A burial form can be adapted to local beliefs. A construction technique can move from one area to another and then develop in a new direction. The Western Caucasus dolmens are therefore part of a wider Bronze Age conversation, but they speak with a local accent. That local accent is visible in the porthole itself. Dolmens exist across many parts of Europe, Asia, and North Africa. But the Caucasus examples are distinctive for their frequent small front openings and carefully built stone chambers. The portal gives them a recognisable face. It also gives the builders a recognisable habit of thinking. The chamber should be enclosed but accessible, sealed but not permanently unreachable, monumental but small enough to be intimate. That is not a universal solution to burial. Many cultures made mounds, pits, stone cists, caves, cremation burials, wooden chambers, or simple graves. The dolmen builders chose this particular form again and again, which means it satisfied both practical and symbolic needs. If we could meet them, they would probably not look like a single image. There would be elders with knowledge of family lines, young adults doing heavy labour, children watching from the edge of work, people skilled in pottery, people who knew animal behaviour, people who understood plants, people who could identify good stone, people who managed exchange relationships, people who remembered rituals. Some may have travelled between valleys, some may have rarely left their local area, some may have lived near the coast, with access to fish, shells, and sea routes. Others may have lived higher in the foothills, with a stronger focus on herding and mountain resources. The dolmen tradition connects them, but it does not flatten them into one identical crowd. Their clothing would have been made from organic materials that rarely survive, such as wool, linen, leather, fur, and plant fibres, depending on available resources and techniques. We should not imagine them as ragged by default. Prehistoric clothing could be practical, skillfully made, decorated, repaired, and meaningful. Textiles are among the great lost arts of archaeology because they decay so easily, but making cloth or clothing requires enormous skill. Spinning fibre, weaving, cutting, sewing, softening hides, preparing fur and maintaining garments are time-consuming tasks. A person's clothing could express age, gender, status, role, or group identity, even if the evidence has mostly vanished. The stone tomb remains, but the woven world around it has gone quiet. Their food, too, was not just survival fuel. Meals create social life. People gather around cooking fires. They share, complain, negotiate, celebrate, and teach. Grain had to be ground. Meat had to be butchered, dried, cooked, or shared quickly. Milk could be processed if animals were managed for dairy. Wild foods could supplement the diet. Nuts, berries, herbs, fish, game, and gathered plants may have mattered depending on location and season. Food also connects to burial. Offerings in tombs, where present, may reflect beliefs about provision, status, or ritual feasting. Even outside the tomb, ceremonies around death often include meals. People eat after funerals not because grief makes them cheerful, But because the living must keep living, and food is one of the clearest ways a community tells itself that it is still here, the porthole people, if we may call them that for a moment, also had to deal with weather. The Western Caucasus can be damp, wooded and mountainous. Stone construction in such a place is not only symbolic, it is a way to resist moisture and time, wood rots, earth shifts, stone remains. Choosing stone for the dead may have reflected a desire for permanence in a landscape where many living structures were temporary or repairable. It may also have marked the tomb as different from ordinary life. The dead were placed in something heavier, colder, and more enduring than a normal house. That difference matters. A dolmen looks house-like, but it is not a copy of everyday domestic architecture. It is a special room, built with special effort, for a special purpose. There may have been ritual specialists involved in opening and closing the dolmens. That is speculative, but plausible. In many societies, not everyone handles the dead in the same way. Certain people know the correct actions, words, timings, or restrictions. Some may be allowed to touch remains while others are not. Some may prepare bodies, some may lead ceremonies, some may remember genealogies. The small porthole could have focused these actions. The plug is removed, the chamber is approached, the remains are placed, the opening is closed. Even if the ceremony was simple, repetition gives it weight. The doorway turns action into sequence, and sequence is often the backbone of ritual. The people behind these monuments probably understood ancestry in a way that was tied to land. That is not the same as modern property ownership with maps, documents, and someone looking for a stamp, but ancestors can anchor people to places. If your dead are in a stone chamber on a hillside, then that hillside is not just land. It is your group's remembered world. Other groups may recognise that. The dolmen may signal presence, history, and rights. It may also help people think of themselves as continuous across generations. The living community changes as people are born and die, but the dolmen remains, collecting the dead into a visible form of continuity. A group can point to the stones and say, in whatever words they used, that they belong. This might help explain why so much labour was invested in structures that were not large inside. From a purely practical perspective, if you only wanted to dispose of a body, a pit would do. Humans are rarely satisfied with purely practical answers around death. The dolmen made the burial visible, durable and repeatable. It required cooperation, and cooperation itself may have reinforced social bonds. Building the tomb could bring people together, using it could bring them back. Maintaining it could keep the dead in public memory. The work was not a waste of energy. It was one way the community built itself. At the same time, we should leave room for uncertainty and difference. Not every dolmen was used in exactly the same way. Not every person in the society may have received the same treatment. Some tombs may have been robbed, reused, cleaned out, reorganized, or altered in antiquity. Some may have had local meanings that changed over time. The archaeological record is uneven. What survives is filtered by geology, later disturbance, excavation history and luck, that quiet but powerful assistant in archaeology. Sometimes luck opens a flooded tomb. Sometimes it removes the one object that would have made everything clearer. Archaeologists have to work with what remains, and what remains is often a mixture of stone certainty and human absence. So who are the people behind the portholes? They were not dwarfs, giants, or a vanished race of fairy builders, however charming those stories may be when told beside a fire. They were human communities of the Bronze Age Western Caucasus, skilled in stone construction, connected to wider regional networks, living from the resources of mountains, valleys, forests, animals, fields, and routes of exchange. They were people who organised labour, remembered their dead, and created a burial tradition so distinctive that thousands of years later we still recognise its face. They were practical enough to cut stone accurately, and imaginative enough to give the dead a small permanent room. They were ordinary in the sense that they had daily work, bodies that grew tired, children who needed feeding, tools that broke, and weather that refused to cooperate. They were extraordinary in the sense that their way of dealing with death still stands, and perhaps the best way to approach them is neither through grand mystery nor dry classification, but through that repeated human act of making a place for the dead, a place for memory, a place a community could return to when someone crossed from the world of voices into the world of ancestors. The porthole was the visible point of contact. Behind it were bones, offerings, and silence. In front of it were the living carrying grief, duty, and belief. Around it was the landscape that gave them food, stone, paths, danger, and belonging. We cannot hear their language, but we can see that they made the dead part of their world in a very deliberate way. From here, the tiny stone houses begin to look less like isolated curiosities and more like part of a larger pattern of life and death. The people who built them were not simply constructing containers for bones. They were shaping a relationship between the household, the community, the ancestors, and the land. To understand that relationship more clearly, we have to look at the uncomfortable but central truth of these monuments. They look like houses, but they were made for the dead, and that resemblance may be one of the most important clues they left behind. That resemblance, the strange closeness between a house and a tomb, is one of the reasons the dolmens stay in the mind. A grave can be many things. It can be a pit in the earth, a mound on the horizon, a cave in a hillside, a wooden chamber, a stone-lined box, an urn, a platform, or a place marked only by memory. But the Western Caucasus dolmens often look like little buildings. They have a front, sides, a back, a roof, and an opening. They are not houses in the usual sense, and yet they borrow enough of the idea of a house that the eye recognizes shelter before the mind remembers burial. The classic Caucasian dolmen form, with its stone chamber and porthole slab, was already present in the region by around 3250 BC, and later dolmens continued to develop across the Western Caucasus through much of the Bronze Age. So perhaps the question is not only why the dead were placed in houses of stone, but why the living felt that the dead needed something house-like at all. A house is not just a place where a body sleeps, it is where a person belongs, it is where food is shared, stories are repeated, tools are stored, children are scolded gently or not so gently, and the weather is kept at a manageable distance. A house creates an inside and an outside. It says, here is our space, here is the hearth, here are the people who return. When a tomb takes on the shape of a house, even in a simplified and symbolic way, it suggests that death did not simply erase belonging. The dead were moved, yes, but they were not made placeless. They were given a chamber. They were given walls. They were given a threshold. This does not mean that the dolmen builders imagined the dead living exactly as the living did. We should not picture Bronze Age ancestors sitting politely in the stone chamber, rearranging their bones and wondering whether anyone remembered to bring more firewood. The chamber was too small, too sealed, too clearly made for burial practice rather than ordinary dwelling. But architecture can speak in resemblance without becoming literal. A child's toy house is not a real house, but it still carries the idea of shelter. A model ship cannot cross an ocean, but it can stand for travel, danger, status, or memory. In the same way, a stone tomb shaped like a tiny house may have carried the idea of protected presence. The dead were not sleeping in a bedroom, but they were enclosed in a meaningful interior. The difference between houses for the living and houses for the dead also tells us something about time. A living house is usually made for use, repair, warmth, and daily change. It is full of movement. People come in and out, smoke rises, food smells drift. Things are dropped, lost, found, broken, mended, and occasionally blamed on someone else. A tomb is different. It is made to slow change down. It is a place of stillness, or at least the hope of stillness. The living house accepts that life is messy and temporary. The stone house for the dead tries to hold memory in place. That may be why the dolmens feel so calm now. They were built to resist the ordinary speed of human life. The irony, of course, is that the houses of the living have mostly vanished. The daily world around the dolmens was made from materials that decay more easily: timber, clay, thatch, woven fibres, skins, and compacted earth. Those materials are practical and sensible when people need warmth and flexibility. They can be repaired after storms, expanded when a household grows, or abandoned when a settlement shifts. But they rarely survive 5,000 years without help from unusual conditions or very lucky archaeology. The houses of the dead, made from great slabs, remain visible, so the dead, who no longer needed shelter in any biological sense, ended up with the stronger architecture. This is one of those little historical unfairnesses that makes archaeology both fascinating and mildly rude. Because of that, we must be careful not to let the dolmens fool us into thinking these communities were obsessed only with death. The living world was larger than the burial world. People cooked, herded animals, planted crops, gathered wood, shaped pottery, repaired tools, raised children, traded, travelled, and complained about things no archaeologist will ever recover. A dolmen was one part of life, not the whole of it. But it was a part that drew on the language of the home. It took the idea of an enclosed place and made it permanent. The living house held people through days and seasons. The dead house held ancestors through generations. Collective burial makes that resemblance even more interesting. Many Caucasian dolmens were not simply single graves. They were used as collective burial chambers, sometimes receiving remains over a long period of time through the front porthole or during stages of use. The Colico dolmen, for example, contained disarticulated remains from around 70 individuals when it was discovered undisturbed, showing how a single chamber could gather many dead together. This is an important clue. A house is normally a shared space. A family or household occupies it. If a dolmen gathered many individuals, then it may have acted less like a private container and more like a house of ancestors, a place where the dead of a group accumulated and remained together. That kind of gathering can change how a community understands itself. The dead are not isolated one by one in separate places, each fading into a private patch of earth. Instead, they are brought into a shared chamber. Their remains may be rearranged as new individuals are added. Earlier bones may be moved aside or placed carefully, depending on the practice. The newly dead join the older dead. Over time, the chamber becomes a physical expression of continuity. It is not only the grave of one person, it is the memory room of a group. If you belong to that group, you might know that those stones held people connected to you by blood, marriage, story, obligation, or identity. The dolmen would not just mark death, it would mark membership. There is something deeply human about this. Even today, families visit graves together. People bring flowers to cemeteries, keep urns at home, place photographs on shelves, maintain memorial days, and speak of ancestors as if they are still part of the household conversation. Modern practices are not the same as Bronze Age practices, of course, and we should not flatten time by pretending they are identical. But the broad impulse is recognisable. Death changes the relationship, but it does not always end it. The living often need ways to keep the dead nearby without keeping them in the ordinary spaces of life. A tomb shaped like a small house solves this problem beautifully. It is near but separate, closed but approachable, permanent but not entirely silent. The porthole is again crucial. A house needs a door because people move through it. A dolmen's small opening is not a normal doorway, but it creates a controlled connection. It allows access without making the chamber open. It makes the tomb neither fully sealed nor fully available. The plug that could close the opening turns the front slab into a threshold with rules. You do not wander in, you approach, you open, you place, you close. Even if the exact ceremony is lost, the sequence is written into the structure. The stone teaches the living how to behave around the dead. This is one reason the phrase house for the dead is useful. but only if we use it gently. It does not mean a literal home. It means a constructed place of belonging. The dead house had no hearth, no bedding, no everyday doorway, and no sign that someone was preparing breakfast inside, which is probably for the best. But it had an interior. It had a front face. It had a boundary. It had a durable relationship to the surrounding land. In many human cultures, those are the essential features of a place. The dolmen turned the dead from bodies that needed disposal into ancestors who occupied a meaningful location. The location itself may have mattered as much as the chamber. A house is never only its walls. It is also where it stands, near water, near fields, near kin, near paths, near danger, near opportunity. Dolmens were part of landscapes, often appearing in groups or clusters, spread through the western Caucasus and along the Black Sea side of the region. If a group returned to the same dolmen over generations, the surrounding place would become charged with memory. Paths leading to it might be known. Approaches might be cleared. A forecourt or area in front could become the space where the living gathered, while the chamber behind the porthole held the dead. The whole arrangement would work almost like a social map. Living bodies outside, ancestral remains inside, and the stone front between them. A living house also reflects the structure of the community that uses it. Some houses hold small families, some hold extended families. Some are arranged around gendered spaces, storage areas, guest spaces, or work areas. The dolmen does not give us that level of detail, but collective burial hints at a social unit larger than a single individual. It may have represented a household, a lineage, a clan, or a local group. We cannot be certain which word fits best, and perhaps none of our modern words fits perfectly. But the repeated use of a chamber suggests that the dead were being gathered according to some rule of belonging. Not everyone in the landscape necessarily went into the same tomb. The dolmen may have answered the question, who are our people in stone? That makes the exterior appearance more important. The dolmen had to be recognisable to the living. It was not only a container hidden underground, it was visible architecture. Even if some were once covered partly by cairns or mounds, the facade and porthole remained key elements of the monument. Some western Caucasus dolmens included a chamber, antechamber, and cairn as parts of the broader construction, showing that the little stone room could belong to a larger mortuary arrangement rather than standing alone as a bare box. The tomb had a public side, a face. That face said something to the community every time they passed it. It said the ancestors were here. It said memory had a location. It said this place had been made with effort and should not be treated as ordinary ground. There is a quiet, practical wisdom in using a small chamber for multiple burials. A large stone monument is hard to build. Once it exists, reusing it makes sense, especially if it belongs to a continuing group. But the practicality may have strengthened the symbolism. Each return to the dolmen renewed the connection between generations. Every opening of the plug repeated an earlier action. Every new deposition added to the old. The chamber became layered with time, not in written pages, but in remains. The living may have known who had been placed there recently, while older individuals became more generalized ancestors. Over time, the specific dead and the ancestral dead may have blended, as memory often does. A great-grandparent with a name becomes, after enough generations, one of those before us. The dolmen could hold both kinds of memory. The house-like form also raises the possibility that the dead were thought to need protection. Bodies are vulnerable. Remains can be disturbed by animals, weather, enemies, or ordinary decay. A stone chamber protects the contents better than an open grave. But protection may not have been only physical. A tomb can protect the living too by placing death in a proper location. Many societies treat the dead with both affection and caution. Ancestors can be helpful, honoured, and beloved. But the boundary between living and dead must still be managed. The porthole and plug may have helped manage that boundary. The dead were present, but contained. The living could approach, but not casually enter. The tomb was a house with a locked front. and that locked front may have mattered emotionally as well as structurally. There is another layer here, one that feels simple but is easy to overlook. A house is built by the living. A tomb is built by the living for people who cannot build for themselves. That means the dolmen is an act of responsibility. The dead no longer gather slabs, cut grooves, drag capstones, or supervise construction with strong opinions. The living do that work on their behalf. Every dolmen therefore records a social obligation. Someone had to be cared for after death. Someone had to be placed properly. Someone had to be remembered in a form that took more effort than a quick burial. This does not tell us exactly what emotions were involved, but it tells us the dead mattered enough to require labour. And labour, again, is never just labour. When a group builds together, it also negotiates relationships among the living. Who leads? Who contributes? Who owes whom? Who is honoured? Who provides food for the workers? Who has the right to decide where the tomb stands? Who may open it later? A dolmen could strengthen social ties, but it could also reflect tensions and hierarchies. The dead may be quiet, but funerals can be socially loud. Anyone who has seen a modern family organise a burial knows that grief does not automatically make human beings simple. There can be tenderness, duty, disagreement, memory, pride, resentment, and love all standing in the same room, looking for a place to put the flowers. Bronze Age people were not immune to complexity just because their paperwork has not survived. So when we say houses for the living, houses for the dead, we're also talking about how a community organises space around life stages. The living may have had houses in the settlement, places of warmth and activity. The dead had stone houses in the mortuary landscape, places of stillness and return. Between them were paths. People moved from one to the other during ceremonies, bringing the concerns of the household to the place of ancestors. A newborn might eventually be introduced to stories of those inside. A young person might help carry offerings. An elder might know which remains belonged to which generation. The dolmen stood outside daily domestic life, but not outside social life. The resemblance between tomb and house may also have helped make death understandable. Death is a rupture. It removes a person from ordinary contact. Architecture can soften that rupture by giving the dead a destination. Instead of vanishing, the person goes to the stone chamber. Instead of being nowhere, they are there. The living can point to the place. Children can be told this is where they are. Again, we cannot know the exact words, but we know the structure allowed that kind of thought. A visible tomb helps transform absence into location. It gives grief something to walk toward. There is a very old human comfort in location. We like knowing where things are. Keys, tools, food, animals, children, memories. The remote control that has somehow entered another dimension. When something important is missing, unease grows. Death creates the greatest absence of all. A tomb does not bring the person back, but it gives the absence an address. The dolmen's little door may have been the address of the dead. Not an entrance for the living, not exactly, but a point of contact. Here, behind this stone, through this opening, among the others. The house-like form may also have connected the dead to the idea of rest. In many cultures, death is described as sleep, though the comparison is imperfect and sometimes too gentle for the reality of grief. Still, the idea of laying someone in a protected chamber has a kind of sleep-like logic. The dead are placed down, the door is closed, the outside world continues, the monument remains. A living house protects sleep from the night. A dead house protects remains from time. Both create an interior where the body is not exposed. Both separate human vulnerability from the open world. This may be one reason tomb architecture so often borrows from domestic forms across many different societies. Yet the dolmens are not cosy in the way a living house is cosy. Their interiors are stone, dark and small. They are not warm. They do not invite lingering. They are less like cottages and more like permanent containers of belonging. That is an important distinction. The modern imagination may want to soften them into little fairy houses or forest cabins, but their purpose was serious. Human bones inside them remind us that these were places where communities confronted mortality directly. The charm of the tiny doorway should not erase the reality of the dead. A dolmen can be visually delightful and emotionally weighty at the same time, much like an old family photograph that makes you smile before you remember the person in it is gone. The builders may have understood that balance better than we do. The stone house was small enough to feel intimate, but durable enough to feel beyond ordinary life. It did not tower. It did not intimidate from a distance. It invited approach, but only to the threshold. This may be part of why the Western Caucasus dolmens feel different from more monumental tombs elsewhere. They do not overwhelm the landscape with size. They sit within it. They make death present at a human scale. You can stand before one and understand its basic form immediately. Then slowly, you realize how much you do not understand. One of the things we do not understand fully is whether the dolmen's house-like form was meant to imitate actual living houses of the region. Because ordinary dwellings rarely survive well, direct comparisons are difficult. It is possible that the tombs reflected aspects of domestic architecture now lost. It is also possible that the resemblance is more general. Enclosure, roof, entrance, chamber. We should not assume a one-to-one copy. Still, the resemblance is meaningful because humans recognize built shelter even when the details differ. The dolmen's form places the dead inside a constructed space rather than simply under the ground. That choice alone matters. The dead inside may not always have been placed as complete bodies. In collective burial chambers, remains can become mixed, moved, or disarticulated over time. That does not make the burial careless. In many societies, bones are handled after decomposition as part of secondary burial practices. Skulls, long bones, and other remains may be arranged, gathered, or transferred. The body changes, and the ritual changes with it. A porthole chamber could support such practices by allowing selected remains to be inserted or rearranged. What looks to a modern observer like disorder may have been meaningful ordering, according to rules we no longer know. Archaeology is often faced with this problem. The past may look messy because we no longer understand the cleaning system. The difference between living houses and dead houses also reminds us that societies often divide space by kinds of presence. The living settlement may be noisy, smoky, and changeable. The burial area may be quieter, more formal, and tied to repeated ceremonies. But the two are linked. Ancestors can legitimize the living. The living maintain the ancestors. The tomb depends on the community for its meaning, and the community may depend on the tomb for continuity. The stone house is therefore not just for the dead. It also serves the living by giving them a past they can see. That visible past may have mattered in a world without written genealogies. If memory is spoken, it can change, fade, or be contested. A monument helps hold it in place. It does not record names, but it records the fact of belonging. It can stand as proof that people before you were here. It can mark a lineage's depth. It can make a claim without words. Stone is persuasive in that way. It does not explain itself, but it takes up space with great confidence. At the same time, the dolmen's silence leaves us with humility. We can describe form, function, and likely patterns of use. We can say that these were megalithic burial chambers with porthole slabs, that many were collective tombs, that they belonged to Bronze Age communities of the Western Caucasus, and that their architecture suggests controlled access and repeated ritual engagement. But we cannot fully enter the emotional world of the builders. We do not know the songs sung outside the facade. We do not know whether people touched the stone before leaving. We do not know whether children feared the opening or found it familiar. We do not know whether the dead were thought to hear, sleep, guard, travel, transform, or simply remain. The House of Stone keeps its interior meanings more securely than it kept all of its physical contents. Still, we can stand before the idea of it and understand something basic. The living built temporary houses for themselves because life moves. They built stone houses for the dead because memory needed weight. The living house sheltered breath. warmth, appetite, and conversation. The dead house sheltered bones, ancestry, and return. One was repaired by daily use. The other was preserved by distance and respect. Between them moved the people of the Bronze Age Caucasus, carrying food, tools, grief, infants, stories, and the ordinary tiredness of human life. And somewhere in that movement, the little stone chamber became more than a tomb. It became a meeting point, not a place where the living and dead mingled casually, but a place where the boundary could be approached. The porthole was the small controlled crossing. The plug was the pause. The chamber was the memory. The facade was the face the ancestors turned toward the world. If the living houses have disappeared into soil, the houses for the dead remain to tell us that these communities cared about continuity, place, and the careful handling of absence. Now the round stone door begins to feel less like a curiosity and more like the centre of the whole design. It was small, but it carried the logic of the monument. It opened and closed the relationship. It allowed the dead to be placed inside and the living to remain outside, close enough to remember, far enough to continue. And to understand what may have happened at that threshold, we have to look more closely at the plug, the aperture, the chamber beyond it, and the quiet rituals that might have turned a stone opening into one of the most important doorways in the ancient Caucasus. The round stone door is small enough that it changes the way we think about the whole monument. If the opening were large, we might imagine people walking in and out, carrying lamps, placing objects, sweeping the floor, perhaps using the chamber like a little room. But the opening is not like that. It is a porthole, a controlled aperture in the front slab, usually far too small for an adult to enter with anything resembling grace. In many Western Caucasus dolmens, the hole is roughly the size of a large bowl or a small window, practical enough to pass things through, but restrictive enough to make every action deliberate. The classic trapezoidal dolmen with this kind of porthole slab was already present in the Western Caucasus by about 3250 BC, which means this little architectural decision was part of the tradition from a very early stage. The first thing the round door tells us is that the chamber was not meant to be casually entered. A normal doorway lets the whole body pass. This opening allows only a limited exchange between outside and inside. A hand can reach through. An object can be placed through, bones can be transferred through. Perhaps a small vessel, a tool, a bead, a piece of food, or some other offering could be introduced into the darkness beyond the slab. But the person doing it remains outside, bent close to the stone, arm extended into a space they cannot fully occupy. That posture matters. Even if we set aside every spiritual interpretation and stay with the plain mechanics of the act, the dolmen forces the living into a particular relationship with the dead. They must approach. They must lower themselves. They must work through a boundary. And because the opening could be sealed, often with a stone plug, it also tells us that closure was part of the design. This was not an open cave where remains could be placed and left exposed. It was a chamber that could be opened and closed again. The plug was not just a convenient stopper, although it was certainly that. It was the difference between access and separation. When the plug was in place, the tomb was sealed. When it was removed, the chamber became reachable for a short time. That sequence, closed, opened, used, closed again, gives the dolmen a rhythm of action. Not a rhythm we can hear now, of course, but one built into the stone itself. The doorway created a ritual schedule, even if the exact words, gestures, and beliefs are gone. It is easy to imagine the plug as a simple stone disc, but to the people using the dolmen, it may have been much more than a loose piece of equipment. It had to fit the opening. It had to be handled carefully. It may have been kept nearby, pressed into place, removed only at certain moments, perhaps by certain people. Even if the action was practical, repeated use could give it meaning. Many ordinary objects become powerful because they are used at the right time, by the right hands, in the right setting. A wedding ring is just metal until a ceremony gives it weight. A key is just shaped material until it opens the door of a home. A stone plug is just a stone until it closes the chamber where the ancestors are kept. So picture, very gently, a small group approaching one of these dolmens. Not a crowd in the modern sense, no loud procession with banners and neat historical costumes, because real prehistory was not kind enough to arrange itself for documentaries. Just people, perhaps kin, perhaps members of a wider group, moving toward a familiar stone front. The ground may be packed from earlier visits. The dolmen may stand in a cleared area, or at the edge of trees, or near other monuments. The people know where to stand. They know who goes forward. Someone removes the plug. Perhaps it takes one person, perhaps two. Perhaps there is a pause. The round opening darkens into the chamber. The air inside is still. What happens next is where we have to be careful. We are not watching a recorded ceremony. We are reconstructing from architecture, burials, comparison and traces. Archaeology can tell us that these structures were used for the dead, often collectively. It can show us human remains inside chambers. It can identify disarticulated bones, objects, dates, and patterns of repeated use. But it cannot give us a full script. It cannot tell us whether someone spoke softly, sang, remained silent, or told a child to stop standing on the wrong stone. We should resist making the ritual too neat. Ancient funerals were human events, and human events are rarely as tidy as diagrams. Still, the evidence gives us a frame. Some Caucasus dolmens contain the remains of many individuals, not just one. The Koliko dolmen, found on the Black Sea coast in 2008, is especially important because it was an undisturbed megalithic structure, and its chamber contained disarticulated remains from about 70 people. Radiocarbon dating indicates that this particular dolmen was used between roughly the 19th and 13th centuries BC, later than the earliest classic porthole dolmens, but very useful for understanding how these chambers could serve as collective burial places over time. Disarticulated remains are worth pausing over because the phrase can sound clinical. It means the bones were no longer arranged as complete bodies in their natural anatomical order. That can happen through disturbance, decay, repeated burial, intentional rearrangement, or secondary burial practice, where bodies are treated in stages. In many societies, the first handling of the dead is not the final one. A body may be placed somewhere temporarily. Later, after decomposition, selected bones may be gathered and moved to a permanent resting place, or older remains inside a tomb may be shifted to make room for newer ones. To us, a chamber of mixed bones may seem disorderly, but to the people using it, there may have been rules. The order may have been social rather than anatomical. The important thing may not have been keeping every skeleton separate, but bringing the dead into the right shared place. The small round door makes sense in that kind of practice. If complete bodies were not always being carried through it, then the aperture could be used for bones, offerings, and smaller bundles. This does not prove one single method for all dolmens across all centuries, but it helps explain why such a restricted opening could be practical. A porthole is inconvenient if you need to walk into the chamber every time. It is much more useful if the chamber is a protected container that receives remains or objects through a controlled entrance. The living do not fully enter the dead house. They serve it from the threshold. That threshold may have been the most important place of all. The chamber inside was hidden. The people outside could gather, speak, watch, remember, and act. The porthole connected the two zones. It was not only a technical feature but the focus of attention. Many dolmens have facades that emphasize the front, and some examples include decoration or carefully worked portals. The front face is the side that meets the living. The chamber holds the dead, but the doorway holds the ceremony. If someone had to place remains through the opening, that person would do so under the eyes of the others. The act would be visible, controlled, and repeatable. The community could witness the dead being brought into the ancestral chamber. There may also have been offerings, pottery, tools, ornaments, food remains, and other materials can appear in burial contexts across many prehistoric societies, though the exact contents of Caucasus dolmens vary, and many monuments have been disturbed. Offerings can mean many things. They may provide for the dead, mark status, accompany a ceremony, represent the living group, or help transform the dead person into an ancestor. We should not assume every object had one simple meaning. A small pot could be practical, symbolic, personal, or all three. A bead could be an ornament, a gift, a marker of identity, or something included because it was attached to clothing. Archaeology often finds the object after the story has gone missing. It can describe the bead, measure it, compare it, date it, and still not know who last touched it with sadness. The round opening may have shaped how offerings were selected. Very large objects could not easily pass through once the chamber was closed by its front slab and roof. Smaller things could. This may have encouraged a ritual of small deposits, bones, vessels, ornaments, food, perhaps bundles of organic material that have not survived. The limitation of the doorway made the exchange intimate. You do not carry a whole room into the dead house, you pass something through, you choose, you let go. Then the stone is closed. That last action, closing, may have mattered as much as placing. To close a tomb is to say that the ceremony has reached its proper pause. The dead are inside, the living remain outside, the plug returns to the opening. The chamber is no longer visible except through the memory of what was just done. If the dolmen was used again later, the closure was not final forever, but it was final for that moment. In human rituals, moments matter. A door closes after a wedding, a coffin is lowered, a candle is blown out, a letter is sealed. None of these actions changes physics in a dramatic way, but they change the state of the social world. Before the plug is replaced, the chamber is open. Afterward, the dead are once again behind stone. We should also think about sound. A dolmen ceremony would not only have been visual, stone as sound. A plug scraping against a porthole would make a rough, heavy noise. A slab touched by a hand gives a dull response. Voices near a stone chamber may echo faintly. If objects were placed inside, they might knock against the floor slab or other remains. These little sounds could become familiar to people who returned across years. The opening of the tomb may have had a sound everyone recognised. Not loud, not theatrical, just the low sound of stone moving against stone, enough to tell the body that something serious was happening. Smell may have mattered too, although we tend to leave it out because it is hard to reconstruct and harder to keep polite. Burial spaces have smells. Damp stone, earth, decay, smoke from fires outside, plants, animal skins, human bodies, resin, herbs, or whatever materials were used in treatment or ceremony. The air inside a sealed chamber would be different from the air outside. Opening the porthole may have released that difference. Modern archaeology rarely captures the sensory world of a ritual, but ancient people lived in bodies, not in academic summaries. They would have smelled the tomb, felt the cold stone, heard the plug move, seen the dark hole, and known what those sensations meant. The ceremonies may have varied depending on the stage of burial. If the dead were first treated elsewhere and only later placed in the dolmen, then the ritual at the porthole might have involved selected remains rather than a fresh body. Some scholars have discussed more complex funerary models for Caucasus dolmens, including the possibility that empty or seemingly looted chambers may sometimes reflect practices involving more than one burial location rather than simple robbery in every case. That idea remains a matter of interpretation, but it is a useful reminder that prehistoric burial could involve movement, return, and transformation rather than a single event. Even if we do not accept one model for all sites, the architecture itself supports the idea of repeated contact. The porthole and plug would be unnecessary if no one expected to open the chamber again. A grave that is meant to be sealed forever can be sealed more simply. The dolmen builders created a durable chamber with a small controlled access point, and that strongly suggests that the relationship between living and dead continued after the first burial. This does not mean the tomb was opened every week, or at every seasonal festival, or whenever someone had a question for great-grandfather. It may have been opened only at deaths, or at specific times, or when a group decided to add remains. But the possibility of reopening was built into the structure. That possibility may have created a long memory of the chamber's contents. Imagine a dolmen used by a community over several generations. At first, everyone may know exactly who is inside. A mother, an elder, a child, a respected craftsperson, a leader, a relative whose habits are still remembered. Later, the names may become fewer. The chamber becomes the place of our dead, then the ancestors, then perhaps simply the old stone house that must still be treated with respect. The round door carries all those stages. It begins as the doorway to specific grief and becomes the doorway to a deeper past. Children may have learned that past through repeated visits. They might have stood behind adults, watching the plug removed. They might have been told not to touch. They might have been frightened by the dark opening, or bored, or curious, or solemn because everyone else was solemn. Children are very good at reading adult seriousness, even when they do not understand it. A dolmen ritual would have taught them where their group's dead belonged, and how the living behaved at that boundary. In this way, the round door was not only for the dead, it educated the living. There may have been feasting nearby. Many funerary traditions include food shared among the living, food offered to the dead, or both. The dolmen itself might not preserve that evidence clearly if activities took place outside, where organic materials decay, and later disturbance scatters traces. But it would not be surprising if gatherings around burial included eating, drinking, or the distribution of goods. Funerals often bring people together who do not gather every day. They renew alliances, settle obligations, display status, and remind everyone who belongs to whom. A stone tomb may be quiet now, but the social event around it may have been busy. Grief and logistics often walk together. Someone mourns, someone carries, someone cooks, someone remembers the correct order of things, and someone is almost certainly in the way. The ritual may also have involved cleaning, rearranging, or removing bones. That can sound uncomfortable to modern ears, but secondary handling of remains has deep roots in many parts of the world. Bones can become less like a body and more like relics of ancestry once decomposition has taken place. Handling them may be an act of care rather than disrespect. In a collective chamber, older remains may need to be moved to accommodate new ones. Skulls or long bones may be grouped. Smaller bones may be gathered. The chamber may be made orderly according to a logic that is no longer visible to us. When archaeologists find mixed remains, they have to ask whether the mixing happened through ritual, decay, later disturbance, looting, or excavation history. It is a difficult puzzle, and the stones do not politely label the answer. The porthole's small size may have made the interior partly unknowable, even to the people using it. If the chamber was dark and access limited, then much of the arrangement inside may have been felt rather than seen. A person reaching through the aperture might work by touch, placing a bundle just beyond the opening or pushing it farther inside with care. If the chamber was opened during construction for initial deposits, later use through the porthole would still be restricted. This creates an interesting kind of intimacy. The living are close enough to touch the interior but not free to occupy it. The dead are close enough to be reached but not fully visible. The doorway is both connection and refusal. The round shape may also have held meaning, though here we must be especially cautious. Circles can mean many things in different cultures: sun, moon, eye, mouth, womb, hole, passage, completeness, or simply the most practical shape for a plug. We cannot read the builder's minds from geometry alone. A round opening may have been chosen because it distributes stress well, because it is easier to seal with a rounded plug, or because it had symbolic value. These possibilities are not mutually exclusive. Ancient builders did not have to choose between practical engineering and meaning. A useful shape can become meaningful because it is used in powerful situations. After generations, the round door may have mattered because it was the form the ancestors' door was supposed to take. There is a temptation to call the dolmen a portal, and in a careful sense it was. Not a magical portal with blue light and dramatic wind, thankfully, because that would make fieldwork difficult. It was a social portal. It connected two states, living community and ancestral chamber. It allowed materials and remains to pass from one side to the other. It helped transform the status of the dead. Before burial, a person's remains were still in the world of the living, requiring attention. After placement, they became part of the dolmen's interior world. The plug completed that transition. A small piece of stone could mark a very large change. We should remember that not every ceremony would have been calm or gentle. The tone of our journey is quiet, but the past itself included pain. Funerals can be raw, deaths can be sudden, violent, expected, untimely, ordinary or devastating. Bronze Age life carried risks from disease, injury, childbirth, conflict, accident, and hunger. The rituals at a dolmen may have held grief that was loud, exhausted, or complicated. A person placed through that little door may have been deeply loved, feared, respected, resented, or barely known by some of those present. Communities are not made of one emotion. The stone chamber gathered them anyway. At the same time, repetition can make even difficult rituals bearable. The dolmen gave people a known form. When someone died, there was a place. There was a sequence. There were actions inherited from earlier generations. This matters because death creates disorder. Ritual provides order, not by removing grief, but by giving grief something to do. The round door was part of that order. It told the hands where to place the remains, it told the eyes where to look, it told the group when the chamber was open and when it was closed. In a world without written funeral instructions, architecture could remember the procedure. The chamber within the dolmen was probably not just an empty container. Its darkness, small size and stone surfaces would have shaped the experience of the remains inside. If multiple individuals were placed there over time, the interior became a dense ancestral space. Not spacious like a hall, not decorative like later tombs, but concentrated. The dead were close together. Their remains shared one enclosure. That may have reflected a belief that the group mattered more than the individual after death, or that individuals became ancestors by joining those who had gone before. It may also have been practical reuse of a difficult-to-build chamber. Again, both can be true. Practicality often becomes tradition, and tradition often makes practicality sacred. From outside, the chamber's contents were hidden. That hiddenness may have protected the dead from ordinary sight. It may also have increased the power of the monument. Things hidden behind a sealed opening tend to grow in importance. A closed door invites memory. People know what is behind it because they have been told, because they were there, or because the community remembers. The porthole allows the tomb to be both visible and concealed. The monument can stand in the open landscape, but the dead remain inside, unseen. That balance may be one of the reasons the dolmen form works so well. The rituals within, then, were probably not within in the sense of people gathering inside the chamber. They were within the relationship created by the chamber. The real ritual space included the approach, the facade, the plug, the porthole, the interior, and the people outside. The small opening was the hinge of the whole event. It made the dolmen active. Without it, the stone house would be a sealed box. With it, the tomb became a place of repeated contact. And once we understand that, the round door no longer looks cute or strange in quite the same way. It becomes serious. It is a piece of ancient design that managed a difficult human problem. How to keep the dead near, but not among the living. How to protect remains, but still reach them. How to allow memory to continue without letting death spill endlessly into ordinary life. The answer was not written in a book. It was cut into a slab. So the next time we picture one of these dolmens under trees, with its small dark circle facing outward, we can imagine more than a mysterious opening. We can imagine hands on a stone plug. We can imagine the careful passing of remains. We can imagine objects placed into darkness. We can imagine a group standing close enough to witness, far enough to let the dead belong to another space. We can imagine the final weight of the plug returning, stone against stone, and the quiet after. Not an ending exactly, because the same doorway might open again years later, when another life had crossed the same boundary, and the community once more came back to the little stone house that held its dead. Beyond that doorway, the dolmen also belonged to a wider world. The people who opened and closed it were not living in isolation, sealed off like the chamber itself. They moved through mountains and valleys, along rivers and toward the Black Sea. They belonged to a Bronze Age landscape where materials, ideas, animals and people could travel farther than we might first imagine. The stone door held the ancestors, but outside it were paths, neighbours, exchanges, and the larger map of the Caucasus, where these quiet tombs were only one part of a much broader human story. Outside the stone door, the world was much larger than the chamber made it seem. The dolmen held the dead in a small controlled space, but the people who built it lived in a landscape of movement. They were not sealed into one valley like bones behind a plug. They walked over slopes, followed rivers, crossed forests, watched the sea, traded objects, borrowed ideas, and probably kept track of neighbours with the same mixture of curiosity, suspicion, politeness, and mild irritation that humans have always brought to nearby communities. The Western Caucasus may look from a distance like a wall of mountains, but mountains are rarely only barriers. They are also guides. They create passes, valleys, seasonal routes, sheltered places, and points of contact. The broader Caucasus region lies between the Black Sea to the west and the Caspian Sea to the east, a position that made it a meeting zone between different ecological worlds, peoples, and exchange routes. For the builders of the dolmens, geography was not a map on a wall. It was the ground underfoot. It was the ridge that told you where the weather was coming from. It was the river valley that could be followed when the forest was too thick. It was the seacoast where movement might be easier in some seasons than dragging yourself through wet woodland and pretending you were enjoying the scenery. It was the pasture that fed animals, the slope that caught sunlight, the spring that did not dry out too soon, the path where traders might appear, and the neighbouring group whose animals had once again wandered somewhere inconvenient. A dolmen may be stationary, but the society around it was not. The Black Sea side of the Western Caucasus is especially important to imagine. The sea is not only water, it is a road, though a dangerous and moody one. Even before large ships and written navigation, coastal movement could connect communities. People could travel along shorelines, carry materials, exchange objects, and hear of distant places. Archaeologists have long discussed whether maritime activity helped spread megalithic ideas around Atlantic, Mediterranean and Black Sea coastlines, though the Caucasus evidence is complex and does not reduce neatly to a simple story of one outside idea arriving fully formed. That is worth saying clearly. The dolmens of the Caucasus were not necessarily imported as a finished tradition from somewhere else, like a set of stone instructions delivered by Bronze Age sailors with very strong backs. They developed in local settings, through local choices, while still existing in a world where contact was possible. This balance matters because old monuments often attract two opposite mistakes. One mistake is to imagine every impressive thing as isolated and purely local, as if people in the past never travelled farther than the nearest stream unless chased by a goat. The other mistake is to assume that any major idea must have come from somewhere else, usually from a more famous civilization with better public relations. The Western Caucasus dolmens sit between those extremes. They show strong local development, but they also belong to a broader Bronze Age world where communities in the mountains, foothills, steppe edges and coastal areas were aware of one another. Trifonov's review of Caucasian megaliths argues that most of these monuments represent a line of local architectural development, extending from at least the last quarter of the 4th millennium BC, while also noting contact zones and cultural overlaps in the northwestern Caucasus. So let us place the dolmen builders in that wider neighbourhood. To the north and northeast lay steppe zones, open landscapes that encourage different forms of movement, herding, and social organisation. To the south and across the mountains were communities of the South Caucasus, with their own traditions, routes and technologies. To the west was the Black Sea. To the east, beyond the great mountain spine and across the broader region, lay further corridors toward the Caspian. This does not mean an ordinary dolmen builder stood each morning thinking, "Ah yes, I live at the crossroads of Eurasia." Most people do not narrate their own geography so dramatically while looking for breakfast. But the effects of that position would have reached daily life in quieter ways. Unfamiliar objects, borrowed styles, metal goods, animals, marriage ties, stories from travellers, and changes in burial practice. The Bronze Age itself was a period of increasing connection in many parts of the Old World. Metalworking was one of the great engines of that connection. Copper, tin, arsenic-bearing ores, gold, silver and other materials did not occur evenly everywhere. Knowledge of mining, smelting, alloying, casting and finishing moved through networks of specialists, exchange, imitation and experiment. The Caucasus was deeply involved in early metal traditions, and recent synthetic work on the region's Chalcolithic and Bronze Age emphasises the importance of metal procurement, interactions with Anatolia and the Near East, and the arrival of steppe influences such as kurgan and wagon traditions. This does not mean every dolmen community was rich in metal, or that every person was walking around with a bronze toolkit, casually misplacing it under a sheepskin. Metal was valuable. Its presence often signalled access, status, or exchange. But the knowledge and movement around metals formed part of the larger world in which the dolmens appeared. Nearby, in time and space, was the Mycop cultural sphere, one of the most important early Bronze Age traditions of the North Caucasus. The Mycop world is known for rich burial mounds, skilled metalwork and evidence of long-distance connections. The relationship between Mycop, Novosvobodnaya and the dolmen building traditions is complicated, and archaeologists do not treat it as one simple line of descent. In the northwestern Caucasus, especially around areas such as modern Adygia, Trifonov notes that Novosvobodnaya-type dolmens with rich grave goods occur in a zone where Mycop and dolmen cultures overlapped, suggesting contact between earlier dolmen and late Mycop groups in the foothills. That is a careful archaeological way of saying that people were close enough to influence one another, but not so identical that we should mash them together into one vague ancient soup. The word neighbours is useful here, because neighbours can share and differ at the same time. They may exchange goods, copy tools, marry into one another's families, compete over land, attend ceremonies, borrow pottery forms, or quietly judge each other's funeral architecture. One group may bury the dead under a mound, another may build a stone chamber with a porthole, a third may combine ideas in a new way. Cultural boundaries are rarely as sharp in daily life as they look in textbooks. Archaeologists define traditions by patterns in material remains, but people living through those patterns may have experienced them through kinship, language, seasonal meetings, rivalry, and habit. The dolmen builders probably knew of other ways to bury the dead. That matters because it means the dolmen was a choice within a world of alternatives. In the northern Caucasus, earlier and neighbouring communities used kurgans or burial mounds as well as other tomb forms. At Novosvobodnaya and the Clady Cemetery, excavations have shown non-megalithic surface tombs with thick clay roofs dating around 3300 to 3200 BC, before the emergence of megalithic tombs in that local sequence. Trifonov points to continuity between some non-megalithic and megalithic funeral practices on the northern slopes, while also emphasising that this does not fully explain the appearance of porthole dolmens on the southern slopes and Black Sea coast. In other words, the story is not a straight road. It is more like a mountain path with several branches, a few missing signposts, and at least one archaeologist standing there with a notebook saying, "Interesting." The sea roads add another layer of possibility. The Black Sea coast could connect communities along a north-south and east-west fringe, even if seafaring in this period was not the same as later historical navigation. Coastal travel often spreads objects and ideas in small steps, a technique moves from one group to the next, a decorative style appears where it was not before. a burial custom is adapted, misunderstood, improved, or made local. It is possible that megalithic ideas in the wider Black Sea and Mediterranean world formed part of the background against which Caucasus dolmens developed, but the specific porthole chamber tradition of the Western Caucasus became its own thing. It was not simply a provincial copy of Atlantic or Mediterranean monuments. It had its own architectural personality: compact chambers, carefully dressed slabs, small apertures, plugs, and in some examples, sophisticated plans and facades. The Jubga dolmen, for instance, located in the Jubga River Valley on the Black Sea coast, stands out for its size and architectural sophistication. Trifonov describes its associated round chambers as made from accurately shaped blocks, cut to fit curved and sloping walls, with a precision that appears almost template-like. That kind of workmanship tells us that the Black Sea coast was not a marginal zone where people passively received ideas from elsewhere. It was a place where builders could experiment, refine, and create monuments of real technical ambition. The coast was a contact zone, but also a creative zone. Imagine then a community living not far from such roots. A person might grow up knowing the dolmen of their ancestors, the river path to pasture, the places where stone could be quarried, and the seasonal times when outsiders might arrive. Some visitors might come from nearby valleys. Others might come from farther away carrying metal objects, ornaments, salt, hides, animals, pottery, stories, or news. Exchange in prehistory was not always commercial in the modern sense. It could be embedded in gift-giving, marriage, feasting, alliances, obligations, and ritual gatherings. One object might travel through many hands before reaching a community. By the time it arrived, nobody at the end of the chain needed to know the first person who made it. That is still true now, except today the mysterious distant object is usually a phone charger, and nobody knows where the good one went. The movement of people may have mattered as much as the movement of things. Marriage ties can connect valleys. Herding can create seasonal mobility. Ritual sites can attract gatherings. Skilled individuals may move or be invited to work. Conflict can push people into new areas. The Caucasus, with its dense patchwork of ecological zones, encourages local identities but also repeated contact. Mountains can preserve difference because communities separated by ridges may develop distinct habits. At the same time, the need to move through passes and along river corridors creates meeting points. This is one reason the region is so culturally complex in later history as well. The land itself encourages both separation and exchange, and for the dolmen builders, the mountains would have structured time. Seasonal movement may have taken people or animals to different elevations. High pastures might be used in warmer months. Lower areas might be more suitable in winter. Forest resources would vary through the year. Rivers could flood. Snow could block passes. The sea could be calm or dangerous. Building a dolmen had to fit into this seasonal world. You do not drag large slabs during the most inconvenient weather, unless the universe has left you no better options. Labour likely gathered when people could spare it, perhaps after harvests, during periods of social gathering, or in connection with funerary needs that could not always wait politely for the calendar. The landscape also shaped what people could make. Stone suitable for dolmens was not just an abstract resource, it came from specific places. Timber for rollers, levers, scaffolds, fires, houses and tools came from forests. Clay for floors, ceiling, pottery or roofs came from local deposits. Animals provided traction, food, hides, wool, bone and status. Metal objects required access to ores or exchange networks. The dolmen is therefore not only a tomb, but a concentrated product of its environment. Mountain stone, forest labour, community memory, coastal contact and Bronze Age technology all meet in one small chamber. Neighbouring cultures may also have influenced what counted as impressive or proper. If nearby groups built rich kurgans, then a dolmen community may have understood monumental burial as one way to express identity among other monument-building societies. But instead of raising a mound over a single elite burial, many dolmen communities built accessible chambers for collective use. That difference is important. A kurgan can emphasize the individual, the warrior, the leader, or the household under a mound. A dolmen can emphasize the chamber, the group, the repeated return. This is not an absolute contrast because burial practices vary widely, but it helps us see that the dolmens were part of a broader conversation about death and status in the Bronze Age Caucasus. The presence of rich grave goods in some Novosvobodnaya contexts and more modest southern dolmen groups also suggests regional differences. Trifonov notes that rich Novosvobodnaya-type dolmens occur in the overlap zone with Maykop culture, while more modest southern groups appear beyond the Maykop range along the Black Sea coast. That detail is useful because it warns us not to treat all dolmens as socially identical. Some communities had access to richer objects, some were closer to certain exchange networks, some may have placed more emphasis on architecture than grave wealth, others may have used simpler chambers but maintained equally meaningful rituals. Archaeology can reveal uneven access to goods, but meaning does not always follow wealth in a simple line. A modest tomb can hold a powerful ancestor. A rich tomb can hold someone everyone privately found exhausting. The Bronze Age neighbourhood also included ideas about wheels, wagons, and step movement. The broader Caucasus Bronze Age saw influences connected to kurgans and wagon cultures, according to recent overview work. Wheeled vehicles, where they appeared, would have changed transport possibilities, though moving dolmen slabs still required local solutions shaped by terrain. The idea of a wagon in a steppe landscape is very different from moving heavy stone through wooded foothills. Technology is always local once it touches the ground. A useful tool in one environment becomes a comedy sketch in another if the path is too steep, too wet, or too full of roots. The dolmen builders may have known of wider transport technologies, but their monuments still depended on hands, levers, ropes, ramps, and careful planning. Language is one of the largest missing pieces. The Caucasus is famous in later times for linguistic diversity, but we do not know what languages the dolmen builders spoke. Their speech is gone. It may have belonged to language families with no direct written trace, or to ancestors of later regional languages, or to languages completely vanished. We should be very cautious here. It is tempting to connect ancient monuments directly to modern identities because it gives the stones a living voice. But archaeology cannot simply point to a dolmen and say with certainty, these exact modern people built it. Populations change, languages shift, traditions are borrowed, replaced, revived, and reinterpreted. The dolmens belong to the deep human history of the region, not to an easy modern label. What we can say is that the builders lived in a culturally rich zone. They had neighbours whose burial customs differed, whose goods may have circulated, whose styles may have been recognised, and whose presence may have shaped local choices. The mountains did not isolate the dolmen builders from the Bronze Age world. They gave them a particular position within it. Their stone tombs were one answer to questions many communities were asking in different ways. How to honour the dead, how to show belonging, how to mark place, how to remember ancestors, and how to display the skill and cohesion of the living. The sea roads and mountain paths also help explain why the dolmen tradition could spread across a region without becoming identical everywhere. Ideas do not travel like stamped coins, unchanged from hand to hand. They arrive in new places and adapt. A community might see or hear of a porthole tomb and decide to make one with local stone. Another might alter the plan. A third might decorate the front differently. A fourth might use a chamber for a longer or shorter period. Over time, the tradition becomes both shared and diverse. This is why archaeologists find patterns and variations together. The repeated form says connection. The differences say local life. It is also possible that the dolmens helped communities negotiate their place among neighbours. A visible tomb tells others that a group has roots in a landscape. It says, "Our dead are here." In a region of movement, such statements matter. Herding groups, farming settlements, traders and travellers All encounter land through claims and memories. A dolmen does not need writing to function as a sign. Its mass and visibility are the message. The chamber says that people have invested labour here. The ancestors inside say the claim is not only practical, but historical. Even if strangers did not know the names of the dead, they could understand that the place was marked. The fact that the dolmen tradition lasted for centuries also suggests that it remained useful in changing conditions. The people of the Western Caucasus did not build 1 or 2 experimental stone tombs and then wander away embarrassed. They built many, across generations. The practice could absorb contact with neighbours, shifts in material culture, and changes in social life. It could persist because it did something important. It held the dead, yes, but it also held identity. It linked communities to place while the wider Bronze Age world moved around them. And this may be the quiet heart of the matter. The dolmen is both local and connected. Its stone came from the local ground. Its builders knew local slopes and materials. Its dead belonged to a local group. Yet the monument also stood within a region crossed by routes of exchange, influence, and movement. It was not a lonely relic at the edge of the world. It was a small stone room in a busy landscape. So when we imagine the round door closing after a burial, we should not imagine silence spreading forever in every direction. Outside, life continued. Animals needed tending, crops needed attention, fires needed feeding, neighbours came and went. Traders moved along river valleys and coastal paths. Metal objects passed from hand to hand. News travelled, ideas changed shape. The mountains watched over all of it, not as a wall, but as a vast uneven network of ridges, routes, shelters, and horizons. The dolmen stayed where it was, holding its dead, while the world around it kept moving. That movement also helps us understand why the mysteries around the dolmens did not end in the Bronze Age. Later people found them too. Some opened them, some reused them, some robbed them, some explained them through legends, some studied them with notebooks, measuring tapes, excavation trenches, and arguments that probably lasted longer than anyone intended. The ancient neighbours gave way to later villagers, travellers, soldiers, antiquarians, archaeologists, tourists, and storytellers. The stones stayed in the landscape, but the meanings around them kept changing, and that is where the next part of their story becomes more tangled. Because once a monument survives long enough, it stops belonging only to the people who built it and begins collecting the imaginations of everyone who comes after. Once a monument has stood in the landscape for long enough, it begins to collect more than moss. It collects explanations. It collects rumours, warnings, half-remembered stories, children's dares, travellers' guesses, local names, scholarly arguments, and the quiet damage left by people who came looking for treasure rather than understanding. The dolmens of the Western Caucasus are not only Bronze Age tombs now, they are also the subject of legends, tour brochures, academic debates, spiritual interpretations, rescue excavations, and sometimes careless footsteps on ancient stone. The original builders are gone, the communities that used the portholes are gone, and the names spoken at the thresholds are gone, but the little stone houses remained visible enough that later generations could not help asking the same question in different words. Who made these? What were they for? And perhaps most naturally of all, why is the door so small? A small door is almost an invitation to folklore. When people find a structure shaped like a house, but too small for ordinary people to live in, the imagination does what it has always done. It invents residents who fit. In parts of the northwestern Caucasus, local traditions have called the dolmens ispan, or similar names often translated as houses of dwarfs, while other stories speak of giants strong enough to build them, or little beings clever enough to persuade giants to do the heavy work. The Adyghe and Abkhazian traditions around dwarf-like beings, including figures associated with the Nart epic world, have helped connect these stone structures to a much older layer of regional storytelling, even though folklore and archaeology are not the same kind of evidence. The result is wonderfully human, A tomb becomes a dwarf house, a builder becomes a giant, and a porthole becomes the front door of a being who was apparently very particular about entrance size. There is something understandable in those legends. They are not archaeology, but they are not foolish either. They are attempts to explain a mismatch. People could see that the dolmens were built with great effort. They could see that the stones were large, carefully placed, and old. They could see that the opening was too small for normal living. So the story split the problem in two. Perhaps giants supplied the strength. Perhaps dwarves supplied the need for tiny houses. It is a neat solution, and honestly more charming than many modern comment sections. Folklore often works this way. It takes a real feature of the landscape and gives it a social life. The dolmen is no longer just a silent object. It becomes part of a tale people can tell beside a fire on a path, or to a child who has wandered a little too close to the dark round opening. But legends also preserve a kind of respect. To call a monument a house of spirits, dwarfs, giants, or ancient beings is to admit that it does not belong to ordinary time. It is not just stone. It is old stone, shaped stone, stone that seems to have intention inside it. Even when the original meaning is lost, later communities may still feel that the place is not entirely ordinary. This feeling can protect a monument if people fear or respect it enough to leave it alone. But it can also attract interference, because anything mysterious invites testing. Someone wants to look inside, someone wants to remove the plug, someone wants to see whether there is gold, someone wants to take a piece home, which is rarely a good idea archaeologically, and not especially elegant as interior decoration either. Looting is one of the shadow stories of the dolmens. Many have been opened, disturbed, emptied, damaged, or stripped of their contents over time. Some disturbance may be ancient, some may be medieval, early modern, or recent. Some may come from people searching for metal, jewellery, or useful stone. Some may come from simple curiosity. Some may come from the fact that a visible tomb is a very obvious target. The Western Caucasus has around 3,000 known dolmens, and modern summaries note that many are in poor condition or threatened by neglect, vandalism, and destruction, even as additional examples continue to be identified. The problem with looting is not only that objects disappear, it is that relationships between objects disappear. Archaeology depends on context. A bead alone can tell us something. A bead found beside a skull near a pottery vessel, in a particular layer of a chamber, with a radiocarbon date from associated remains, tells us much more. Remove it casually, and the story collapses into a souvenir. It is a little like tearing one sentence from a letter, and then expecting future readers to understand the whole romance, family argument, shopping list, and weather report. Looters may imagine they are taking treasure, but often they are taking grammar. They remove the arrangement that lets the past make sense. This is especially damaging for dolmens because so much of their meaning lies in repeated use. If a chamber contains many individuals, mixed remains, offerings, and traces of opening and closing, then the exact arrangement matters. Were the bones placed in stages? Were skulls grouped? Were older remains moved aside? Did offerings cluster near the porthole or deeper in the chamber? Were there signs of later reopening? These are the kinds of questions archaeologists ask, and they require careful excavation. A disturbed dolmen can still be studied, but many answers become harder or impossible. The round door survives, but the actions that once passed through it become blurred. There is also an interpretive complication here, because not every empty or disturbed dolmen may have been simply robbed. Some scholars have discussed the phenomenon of looted or empty dolmens in the Caucasus, and raised the possibility that, in certain cases, the absence or rearrangement of remains could reflect more complex funerary practices rather than only treasure hunting. This does not mean looting was not real. It was. It means that archaeology has to be cautious before calling every empty chamber a crime scene. Sometimes the missing contents were removed by later intruders. Sometimes the ancient ritual itself may have involved movement between places, temporary deposition, or secondary treatment of remains. The difficult part is telling the difference after thousands of years, especially when the tomb has also had visitors with shovels, boots, and very poor manners. That is why undisturbed discoveries matter so much. The Colico dolmen, found on the Black Sea coast in 2008, was a rare case of an undisturbed megalithic structure, and its burial chamber contained disarticulated remains from around 70 individuals. Radiocarbon dating showed that it was used between roughly the 19th and 13th centuries BC, later than the earliest classic dolmens, but still extremely valuable for understanding collective burial and the long life of the tradition. Finds like that are precious not because they answer everything, but because they preserve relationships. The bones, chamber, dates, architecture, and setting can be studied together. The dolmen speaks in a fuller voice, even if it still whispers rather than explains itself loudly with diagrams. Colico also reminds us that mystery is not the opposite of evidence. A common mistake is to treat anything unexplained as if archaeology has failed, leaving the field open for whatever answer sounds most dramatic. But real archaeology is full of partial knowledge. We can know that a dolmen was used as a collective tomb and still not know the exact words spoken during burial. We can date a structure and still not know the names of the people inside. We can identify disarticulated remains and still debate the sequence of funerary practice. That is not weakness. That is how evidence works. It gives boundaries to imagination. It says, "You may wonder, but please wonder honestly." The dolmens have attracted many speculative ideas over the years. Some people have imagined them as energy chambers, ancient observatories, sound devices, portals, or the remains of lost civilizations with knowledge far beyond their time. A little mystery is healthy. It keeps curiosity awake, although ideally not so awake that it refuses to sleep after this video. But there is a difference between curiosity and replacing evidence with wishful fog. The dolmens are impressive enough without giving them imaginary powers. Their real achievement is already astonishing. Bronze Age communities cut, moved, fitted and used stone chambers across a difficult mountain and coastal landscape for centuries. They created a recognizable architectural tradition with technical skill, social coordination, and deep ritual meaning. That is not less wonderful because it involved humans rather than aliens, giants, or a committee of unusually organized forest gnomes. The real mysteries are quieter and better. For example, why did this exact porthole form become so important in the Western Caucasus? Why did some communities invest so much care in fitted slabs, grooves, decorated facades, and controlled entrances? How did the earliest dolmen forms develop from local or neighbouring burial traditions? Why are some dolmens clustered in large groups while others stand more separately? How did use change between the earliest examples, such as Shepsi around 3250 BC, and later dolmens like Colico? The Shepsi dolmen is especially important because radiocarbon dates show the classic trapezoidal construction, with a porthole slab appearing in the region by about 3250 BC, and its material context links it to a time when it coexisted with Novosvobodnaya type traditions of the Mykop cultural sphere. That is a real mystery with a foundation under it. Not who from another planet built this, but how did local communities develop and sustain this specific mortuary architecture within a changing Bronze Age world? Another mystery is social. Who was allowed inside the ancestral chamber, or at least through the porthole? Not everyone in a community necessarily received the same burial treatment. Some people may have been placed in dolmens, others elsewhere. Some dolmens may have represented lineages or households. Some may have held higher status dead, while others gathered broader groups. Grave goods, architecture, location, and body treatment may offer clues, but they do not translate neatly into modern categories. We would like to know whether the people inside were related biologically, socially, ritually, or all of these at once. Isotopic studies, ancient DNA, and careful osteology can help, But even the best science cannot simply look at a bone and hear the family story attached to it. There are mysteries of movement too. Were the people buried in a given dolmen local to the region, or had some come from elsewhere? Strontium isotope studies, like those applied to Colico, can investigate where individuals may have spent parts of their lives by comparing chemical signatures in teeth and bones to local geology. This kind of work is a beautiful example of modern science listening to ancient bodies without asking them to speak in words. Tooth enamel can preserve traces of childhood environment. Bone can reflect later life. Together, they can suggest mobility, migration, or local residence. But even here, interpretation is careful. Geology overlaps. Diet complicates signals. People move in ways that chemistry can only partly capture. The past always keeps one hand over part of the answer. There are also mysteries of preservation. Some dolmens look almost complete, while others are collapsed, broken, or missing slabs. Some have been restored. Some were damaged by forestry, construction, tourism, or treasure hunting. Some survive in remote places, while others stand near roads, villages, or resort areas. A monument's present condition is not a simple measure of its ancient importance. A modest dolmen may survive beautifully because it was ignored. A major one may be badly damaged because everyone noticed it. Archaeological fame is not always kind to archaeology. Once a site becomes attractive, it needs protection. Otherwise, curiosity can slowly become erosion with a camera. Tourism brings a mixed legacy. On one hand, visitors can help create public appreciation, and public appreciation can lead to protection. People are more likely to defend monuments they know and value. On the other hand, too much unmanaged visitation can damage fragile sites. Climbing on capstones, touching decorated surfaces, leaving trash, moving stones, lighting fires, or entering chambers can harm structures that were never designed for modern crowds. A dolmen may have survived 4,000 years of weather and still meet its match in a group of people who all want the same photograph. This is not a cheerful thought, but it is a useful one. Ancient stones do not need us to worship them. They need us to behave. Legends can help with that if they are handled respectfully. A story about dwarf houses or giant builders may not explain the archaeological origin of the dolmens, but it can keep local attachment alive. Folklore is part of a monument's later life. It tells us how communities after the Bronze Age made sense of inherited stones. It also reminds us that the dolmens did not sit in a vacuum between excavation seasons. They were part of lived landscapes for shepherds, villagers, travellers, children, Cossacks, Highlanders, scholars and tourists. Each group saw something different. A tomb, a mystery, a house of spirits, a treasure vault, a scientific site, a sacred place. A good spot for a bad decision involving a flashlight. We should be careful not to laugh too much at folklore while accepting our own assumptions too easily. Modern people also build stories around ancient monuments. We may use scientific language, but we still have favourite narratives. We like lost civilizations. We like sudden migrations. We like technical puzzles. We like origins. We like the idea that one discovery will unlock everything, preferably before lunch. Archaeology usually refuses to be that tidy. It gives us a Shepsey date here, a Colico burial chamber there, a damaged cluster somewhere else, a decorated slab, a missing plug, an unexpected isotope result, a new survey, a revised interpretation. The whole picture forms slowly, like a mosaic assembled in dim light while someone keeps misplacing the tiles. The mysteries that remain are therefore not empty spaces to fill carelessly. They are invitations to better questions. We may not know the full belief system of the dolmen builders, but we can ask how architecture controlled access to the dead. We may not know the exact origin of the tradition, but we can compare early sites, construction details, and neighbouring cultures. We may not know every cause of empty chambers, but we can distinguish looting from possible ancient practices when evidence allows. We may not know the names of the people inside, but we can study age, sex, health, diet, mobility, and burial sequence. The darkness behind the porthole is not a wall. It is a slow doorway for research. And still, even after all the careful science, something remains outside measurement. Not supernatural necessarily, just human. The feeling of standing before a structure built by hands 5,000 years gone. The feeling that the small round opening has seen more grief, ritual, weather, and curiosity than any one person can hold in mind. The knowledge that people once returned to this place with their dead, and that later people returned with stories, tools, greed, reverence, notebooks, and questions. A dolmen is not only what its builders made, it is also everything that happened to it afterward. In that sense, looters and legends are part of the same long afterlife, though not morally equal. Legends may distort, but they can preserve wonder. Looting destroys wonder by tearing away evidence. Legends say, this place matters because it belongs to a story. Looting says, this place matters only if I can take something from it. Archaeology tries to answer differently. It says, this place matters because relationships remain here, and they must be read with care. The stone, the chamber, the bones, the missing objects, the local names, the damage, the repairs, the landscape, all of it belongs to the record. So the dolmens remain caught between what is known and what is imagined. We know they were Bronze Age megalithic burial monuments. We know many were built with careful stoneworking and porthole facades. We know they were used for collective burial in at least many cases. We know the tradition began very early in the Western Caucasus and continued for centuries. We know they later attracted legends, disturbance, and modern fascination. But we do not fully know what the builders believed, how every ritual unfolded, why the forms spread as it did, or how each community understood the ancestors inside. That is not disappointing. It is the reason the little doorway still works on us. Because perhaps the best mysteries are not the ones that demand a dramatic answer. They are the ones that keep us attentive. They make us look again at a stone plug, a cut groove, a porthole, a damaged chamber, a local story about dwarfs, a scholar's careful date, a bone with a chemical trace of childhood water. They remind us that the past is not a locked room waiting for one perfect key. It is more like a dolmen itself, partly open, partly sealed, built with care, damaged by time, and still facing us with a small dark entrance that invites patience. And as we leave the legends and the looters behind, not forgetting them, but letting them settle into the longer story, the dolmens become quiet again. They return to the forest, the hillside, the river valley, the coast road. They no longer need to be giant houses, dwarf houses, treasure vaults, or unsolved riddles with dramatic music underneath. They can be what they are, ancient stone chambers made by human communities for their dead, changed by every age that encountered them, and still strong enough to hold a question. After 5,000 years, their whisper is not loud, but it is persistent, and if we listen carefully, it leads us back to the simplest and deepest thing these tiny houses have been saying all along. The simplest and deepest thing these tiny houses have been saying all along is that people wanted the dead to remain somewhere. Not everywhere, not nowhere, not lost in the forest or scattered into a vague distance, but somewhere known, behind a small round opening. Inside a chamber made by hands, under a roof slab heavy enough to outlast the voices that once gathered around it. That may sound like a modest message after all the stone cutting, the mountain roots, the Bronze Age neighbours, the legends, the looters, and the long archaeological debates. But modest messages are often the ones that survive best. The dolmens do not explain the universe. They do not give us a complete history of their builders. They do not tell us the names of the people inside, or the language spoken beside the porthole, or whether someone cried quietly while the plug was pushed back into place. What they do give us is a fact made of stone. These communities cared enough to build, and that care is not vague. It was practical, heavy, organised care. Someone chose the stone, someone cut it, someone moved it, someone prepared the ground, Someone understood how slabs must lean, lock, and carry weight. Someone shaped the front stone and opened that small round doorway. Someone made or fitted the plug. Someone came back later, perhaps again and again, to use the chamber as more than a sealed container. After 5,000 years, the dolmen still whispers that memory is not only something in the mind. Sometimes memory is a place. Sometimes it is a wall. Sometimes it's a doorway too small for the living to enter, but just large enough for them to keep reaching toward the dead. This is one reason these monuments feel so different from ordinary ruins. A ruined house tells us about daily life that has moved elsewhere. A ruined fortress tells us about defense, power, conflict, and the inconvenience of having enemies with ladders. A temple tells us about worship and public gathering. A dolmen sits somewhere between the personal and the communal. It is not a palace or a village house. It is not grand in the way a later city monument might be grand. It is low, contained, almost humble. Yet it holds one of the biggest questions human beings face. What do we do with the dead, and how do we keep living after we have placed them somewhere we can no longer follow? The people who built the Caucasus dolmens answered that question with stone chambers. Other cultures answered with mounds, caves, urns, pyramids, cemeteries, cremation grounds, wooden tombs, or memorial posts. There is no single human answer to death, but there is a recurring human need to give death form. We make a place, we mark it, we return to it, we speak there differently, we behave there differently. We may bring objects, food, flowers, lamps, stones, or silence. The details change across cultures and centuries, but the pattern is familiar enough that a Bronze Age dolmen can still make sense to us even when its exact rituals are gone. We do not know what the builders believed, but we understand that the place mattered. The dolmens also whisper that the past was not simple. It is tempting to look at ancient stone structures and imagine a single clean story. A people built them, a belief explained them, a ritual used them, a later age forgot them. Nice, tidy, and ready to be filed away before bedtime. But the actual story is messier. The dolmens appeared early, changed over time, spread through a complex region, varied in construction, and were used by communities who lived among mountains, forests, sea routes, neighbouring cultures, and shifting Bronze Age networks. Some tombs were rich in context, some were damaged, some were emptied, some were reused, and some were wrapped in stories of giants, dwarfs, and mysterious ancient beings. A dolmen is not one answer. It is a meeting place of many answers, some archaeological, some legendary, some practical, and some still missing. That is not a weakness. It is what makes them human. Human traditions are rarely born fully formed and then repeated without change for centuries. People adapt, they borrow, they argue, they improve techniques, they forget parts of old practices and invent new ones while insisting they have always done it this way, which is a very ancient habit and not limited to holiday recipes. The Western Caucasus dolmens were part of that living process. Some builders may have copied older monuments, others may have experimented with a different plan or facade. Some communities may have emphasized collective ancestry, others may have used the tomb for a narrower group. Some may have seen the dolmen as a house for the dead, some as a chamber of ancestors, some as a necessary place in a sequence of funerary acts we can only partially reconstruct. The stones are consistent enough to show a tradition, but varied enough to show real people at work. They whisper too about skill without writing. Modern people often treat written records as the beginning of serious history, as if everything before text were a long, dim waiting room where humanity sat patiently until someone invented paperwork. But the dolmens make that attitude look very silly. Their builders had knowledge. They knew materials, weight, balance, construction, terrain, and cooperation. They worked with stone in ways that still impress us. They built chambers durable enough that the rest of their world, made of wood, earth, fibre, and breath, has mostly vanished around them. They did not need to write down their engineering principles for those principles to be real. The slabs themselves are the record. A cut edge is a sentence. A fitted joint is a method. A roof still resting on its walls is a quiet demonstration that someone understood what they were doing. At the same time, the dolmens remind us that skill and belief were not separate. The people who built them were not modern engineers hired by a funeral committee. In small Bronze Age communities, the making of a tomb would have been embedded in social life. Practical knowledge served ritual purpose. Moving a slab was also helping a dead person, a family, a lineage, or a community. Cutting the porthole was also making the threshold through which remains and offerings might pass. Closing the stone plug was also closing a moment of contact. The work had weight because the stones were heavy, but it also had weight because the dead mattered. Perhaps that is one of the strongest whispers left after 5,000 years. The dead were still part of the community. Not in the same way as the living, not sitting at the hearth or walking the paths or tending animals, but still present in a controlled, placed, remembered way. A dolmen allowed the dead to gather. It created an ancestral interior. It gave the living a place to come back to when another person needed to join those already inside. The small porthole made that relationship manageable. It was neither fully open nor permanently unreachable. It was a boundary that could be crossed only in certain ways. That kind of boundary is important in human life. We need closeness, and we need distance. We need memory, and we need the ability to continue cooking dinner, feeding animals, raising children, and repairing the roof even after grief has entered the house. The dolmens stand at that balance point. They do not deny death. They do not let it dissolve into nothing. They place it in stone and then allow life to go on around it. The living return to their homes, their fields, their herds, their paths, their sea roads, their arguments, their weather, and their ordinary days. The dead remained in the chamber. The relationship continued, but life did not stop. This may be difficult to prove in every detail, but the architecture points toward it. The tomb is durable, but the door is controlled. The ancestors are present, but enclosed. The community remembers, but keeps moving, and movement was everywhere outside these little stone houses. The mountains rose behind them. Rivers cut through valleys. The Black Sea opened a broad, shifting horizon. Neighbouring groups came and went, bringing goods, technologies, marriage ties, styles, and stories. Bronze Age life in the Caucasus was not frozen in one perfect ancient moment. It changed. New influences arrived. Metalworking developed. Burial customs shifted. Some monuments were built, used, reopened, forgotten, found again, robbed, studied, and photographed. The dolmens themselves stayed still, but their meanings moved through time. The builders may have seen them as ancestral chambers. Later communities may have seen dwarf houses. Looters saw possible treasure. Archaeologists saw evidence. Tourists see mystery. Each age brings its own question to the porthole. That is worth remembering because we too are now part of the afterlife of these monuments. The moment we look at them, describe them, film them, write about them, visit them, or wonder about them before sleep, we add another layer of meaning. We are not the original audience, but we are an audience. The stones have outlived the ceremonies they were made for and entered a different kind of conversation. That gives us a responsibility. Ancient monuments are not props. They are not puzzles placed in the landscape for our entertainment alone. They are the remains of other people's serious acts. We can be curious, even playful in our comparisons, because a little gentle humour helps us stay awake long enough to learn. But the curiosity should be respectful. The dolmens have endured enough without modern people treating them as climbing frames, treasure boxes, or convenient backgrounds for dramatic poses involving very serious facial expressions. Their survival also reminds us how much has already been lost. For every dolmen that still stands, there may be details gone forever. Wooden structures around it, organic offerings, painted surfaces if any existed, spoken names, songs, body treatments, processions, food shared outside, and the exact order in which the plug was moved. We often talk about the past as if it is hidden, But sometimes it is not hidden. Sometimes it is gone. The best we can do is attend carefully to what remains. A bone, a shard, a slab, a groove, a chemical trace in tooth enamel, a radiocarbon date, a local legend, a damaged facade. These are small pieces, but together they create a more honest picture than any single grand fantasy could. And still, even after all that loss, the dolmens are not empty of meaning. They tell us that Bronze Age communities in the Western Caucasus created a distinctive way of placing their dead in the world. They tell us that these communities had shared architectural knowledge and social organisation. They tell us that ancestors, memory and place mattered. They tell us that the Caucasus was a landscape of both local traditions and wider connections. They tell us that later people continued to notice these monuments, even when they no longer understood them. And they tell us that human beings, separated by thousands of years, can still recognise the seriousness of a doorway. That may be the quietest and most moving part. The little round opening works on us because we understand thresholds. We know what it means for a door to close. We know what it means to stand outside a room we cannot enter. We know what it means to place someone somewhere and walk away. We know what it means to return to a place because memory has weight there. The dolmen does not need to explain all of this. It simply presents the shape: outside, inside, opening, closure. The rest of us bring our own human experience to meet it. And maybe that is why these tiny stone houses still feel alive in the imagination, even though they were made for the dead. They're not alive because spirits must be hiding inside, or because the stones hum with secret energy, or because some lost civilization left a message only the chosen can decode. They feel alive because they were made out of relationships. Living hands made them for dead bodies. Living communities returned to them. Later storytellers renamed them. Modern archaeologists studied them. Curious travellers still stop before them. The dolmens continue to connect people across time, even when those people misunderstand one another completely. That is a remarkably durable kind of life for a small stone box in the woods. So if we return now to the first image, the one that brought us here, we see it differently. At the beginning it was a tiny house in the forest with a strange little door. It seemed almost whimsical, almost like something from a story. Now the same structure is heavier with meaning. The front slab is not just a wall, it is a face turned toward the living. The porthole is not just a cute round entrance, it is a controlled threshold into an ancestral chamber. The roof slab is not just an impressive stone, it is proof of labour, planning and shared purpose. The chamber inside is not empty darkness, it is the place where a community placed its dead and returned, perhaps for generations, to keep that relationship alive in the only way they knew. And the people themselves feel a little closer, though still beyond reach. We cannot call them by name. We cannot hear their language. We cannot sit by their fires and ask them what the dolmen meant, which is probably for the best because arriving 5,000 years late with questions would be socially awkward. But we can see that they were capable, organised, emotional, practical, and thoughtful. They had to live with weather, hunger, work, neighbours, births, illness, aging, and death. They did not have our science, but they had their own knowledge. They did not have our words for archaeology, but they made places that archaeologists now study. They did not know us, but they left something that still asks us to slow down and pay attention. That is perhaps the final whisper of the dolmens. Slow down. Look closely. Do not rush to explain everything. Notice the stone before inventing the legend. Notice the craft before reaching for the impossible. Notice the dead before chasing treasure. Notice the landscape before isolating the monument. Notice the ordinary humanity behind the ancient mystery. The dolmens are mysterious, yes, but their mystery is not empty. It is filled with work, grief, memory, and the stubborn kindness of making a place for those who can no longer make one for themselves. And now, dear listener, we have walked a long way from that first little doorway. We have moved through forests and foothills, across Bronze Age paths, past stonecutters and mourners, past sea roads and neighbouring cultures, past legends of dwarfs and the sad damage of looters, and back again to the quiet chamber itself. You're a little farther along your own evening than when we began. Perhaps the room around you has grown darker. Perhaps the world outside has gone quieter. Perhaps time has done what it always does when a story is told slowly and softly, stretching in some places, slipping away in others. So let me ask you once more, gently, before we leave the stones to their long silence. Where are you listening from tonight? Are there old places near you, old walls, old graves, old roads, or old trees that make you feel connected to people whose names you will never know? And if you ever stood before one of these Caucasus dolmens, with its little round door facing you from the forest, would you feel curiosity first, or respect, or that small shiver that comes when the past seems suddenly less distant than it should? If this quiet journey through ancient stone, mountain paths, and human memory has brought you a little calm, I would be ever so grateful if you liked the video, subscribed, or shared it with someone who might enjoy falling asleep with old questions instead of new worries. The dolmens have waited 5,000 years without asking for much attention, which is more patience than most of us manage when a kettle is taking too long. But when we do give them attention, they offer something rare. Not a complete answer, not a dramatic secret, just a small doorway into the deep human need to remember. And so, wherever you are, whatever time it is in your corner of the world, let the little stone houses of the Caucasus settle back into their forested slopes. Let the round doors close softly in the mind. Let the mountains grow quiet. Let the sea roads fade into darkness. The people who built the dolmens are gone, but their stones remain, holding the old shape of care. Sleep well, fellow traveller, and may your own night be sheltered, gentle, and undisturbed.